Ark Raiders has some of the most unsettling lore I've come across in any game released this year, and after spending several weeks carefully going through all of it, I put together this collection of stories just for you. I made this video because I kept running into fragments of lore scattered across the Ark Raiders world that I could not stop thinking about. They are not all obvious. Some of them are tucked into small details that you could easily miss on a first pass, and some of them only mean what they mean when you put them alongside other things. I spent a lot of time deciding what order to present these in. In the end, I chose to start from the surface and work inward, because that mirrors the way most players first experience the world. One specific choice I made when putting this together was to hold back some of the more theoretical interpretations until the evidence had a chance to build on its own. I wanted the picture to emerge before I pushed any reading of it. Some of what I share is grounded in documented lore. Other parts are interpretations, possibilities, one way of looking at something that could go several directions. I will always try to make that distinction clear. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The Surface. The surface of Earth in the world of Ark Raiders is not what it used to be. Humanity has been driven underground. The sky, which was once something you looked up at for comfort, for stars, for weather forecasts and open blue air, has become the most dangerous place in the known world. The things that fall from it are called Ark, and they have been falling long enough that most living people have never known a world without them. The records of what the surface looked like before the first drop are fragmented. The cities are still up there, just buried under years of bombardment, rearranged by impacts, hollowed out by the things that crawl through them after a drop. The surface is not dead. That is the part that should bother you. It is very much alive. Raiders are the people who go up there. Not because they want to, or most of them anyway, but because the underground cannot sustain itself without what the surface still has. Scrap metal, old technology, food that grows in the ruins where the sun still reaches through cracks in collapsed rooftops, medicine cached in old hospital storerooms, data still sitting on dead servers, waiting for someone to plug in and pull it out. Raiders are supply runners, scavengers, and by the nature of the job, they are also the most exposed people in the post-Ark world. They go up, they come back, or they do not. And when they do come back, they bring things with them. Not always physical things. The first story I want to tell you is not from any specific piece of in-game lore. It is something that several raiders have described independently, which is one of the reasons it carries the weight it does. It is about what the surface sounds like. Not during a drop, when everything is noise and impact and heat, but in the quiet after, the hours between a drop and whatever comes next. There is a sound that experienced raiders have reported consistently enough that the settlement started documenting it. They call it the settling. It sounds, by most accounts, like a building breathing, like something enormous shifting its weight underground, far below even the settlement levels. It is not structural. The engineers checked. It comes from deeper than anything they have built. The settling is not the worst part of the sound. The worst part is that it has a rhythm. Irregular, but there. Not constant enough to be mechanical, not variable enough to be random. One raider named Serova, whose field logs were recovered by her settlement after her third and final surface run, described it as listening to something sleep. She wrote that down in the margin of a supply manifest. Listening to something sleep. She crossed it out and then wrote it again. The double entry, the crossing out and the rewriting, suggests she thought about it long enough to reject the phrasing and then decided it was accurate enough to keep. That is a specific kind of unease that does not come from nothing. Surface expeditions follow specific protocols, and the protocols exist because every deviation from them has historically resulted in someone not coming back. The first rule is time-limited exposure. You go up, you work, you come back before the next drop window. Arc entities do not operate on a schedule that humans have been able to fully map, but there are patterns. The drops cluster, they space out. There are windows in the pattern that are relatively safer, and expeditions are timed to hit those windows. The second rule is radio contact every 15 minutes. Not because there is always something useful to report, but because the act of reporting confirms you are still capable of reporting. The third rule is never go into a structure that has been recently disturbed. Recently is defined loosely. Within the last cycle, if something has already been in there, you do not know what it left behind. Rule 3 is the one that gets broken most often, not because raiders are reckless, because the best materials are almost always in structures that have already been visited, by Ark, by other raiders, by whatever else moves through the ruins up there that the field teams do not have good names for yet. The logic goes that if something was already in there, and is not still in there, then maybe it is safe now. That logic has a flaw in it that is obvious once you think about it long enough. If something was in there and left, it left for a reason. And if it left for a reason, that reason might involve coming back. The settlement records contain dozens of accounts that follow the same shape. A raider goes into a disturbed structure. The raider finds what they were looking for. The raider notices something odd on the way out. The something odd varies. A door that was closed when they entered is now open. Footprints in the dust that do not match the raider's own. A smell that was not there before, described variously as burning plastic, iron, wet concrete, something sweet and wrong in a way that is hard to articulate. The accounts diverge after that. Some raiders make it back, and the odd thing stays odd, but unresolved. Some raiders do not make it back. A small number of accounts end with the raider describing something they saw before transmitting went dark. One of those accounts came from a raider operating under the call sign Bracket. Bracket was experienced, 4 years on the surface, more runs than most people twice their age. Their final transmission was picked up by a relay station at the edge of the drop zone and retransmitted to the settlement automatically. It was flagged immediately because of the tone, not the content. The content was calm, almost clinical. What flagged it was that Bracket's voice had no inflection. 0. Completely flat. Not distressed, not calm, just empty of all variation in a way that does not happen naturally in human speech. They reported a location, a structural reference, and then they said, "There is something behind me, but it has been behind me for a while, and it knows I know." And then the transmission ended. Bracket's equipment was recovered 8 days later, half a kilometre from the location they reported. There was no sign of Bracket. The reason I am starting with Bracket is not because their case is the most dramatic. It is because of what the recovery team found with the equipment. Bracket's field log, which they kept on a physical notebook because they did not trust digital storage on the surface, was still in the pack. Most of it was normal. Supply notes, route markings, observations about arc movement patterns in that sector. The last 3 pages were different. The first of those 3 pages had a single sentence written on it. The sentence was, "It has been watching since the first structure." The next page had a series of marks that the settlement's analysts eventually decided were not letters but might be a tally. The third page was blank except for a handprint at the bottom. The handprint was not Bracket's. I want to pause on that detail because it is easy to read past it. The handprint was not Bracket's. It was close. The size was similar. The general shape was human enough that the first analyst who looked at it noted it without flagging it, assuming it was a smudge or a print from a glove that did not match Bracket's glove type. A second analyst looked more carefully. The proportions were off. Not wrong enough to be obviously non-human at a glance, but wrong enough once you measured that the hand that made the print would have had fingers that were each slightly too long and slightly too narrow to belong to a human being. The print was also made in something that was not ink and not blood, and not any substance the settlement's lab was able to conclusively identify. Brackett's case is one that the Settlements Research Division still keeps open, which is notable because most missing raider cases are closed within a year. The open designation means that new information could still come in, which means the Research Division has not fully ruled out the possibility that Brackett is still out there somewhere. Given the timeline, that possibility is grim in any interpretation. Either Brackett is long dead and the open case is administrative inertia, or there is something about Brackett's case that the settlement knows or suspects that it has not fully released into the general record. Both possibilities are uncomfortable. The second one more so. I am going to move away from Brackett now and talk about the surface more broadly, because there are patterns that recur across many raider accounts that are worth laying out before we get into the specific stories. The first pattern is what experienced raiders call the watching feeling. It is exactly what it sounds like. The sensation that something in the ruins is tracking your movement. Not necessarily following you or not yet, just aware of you, oriented toward you in some way that you can feel even when you cannot see anything to attribute it to. This feeling is almost universal among raiders who have done more than 10 surface runs. It becomes less alarming over time, not because it goes away, but because survivors learn to live with it. The second pattern is auditory. Specific sounds that do not fit the environment. Ruins have a sound profile, wind through broken structures, debris settling, the distant mechanical noise of arc entities when they're active. These are the background sounds of the surface, and experienced raiders are attuned to them the way you might be attuned to the sounds of your own home. What they notice, and what consistently shows up in field logs, is sounds that do not belong. Human sounds, specifically. Voices at a distance that resolve into nothing when approached. Footsteps that stop when you stop. Coughing. Breathing. Once, memorably, what 3 separate raiders on 3 separate occasions in the same sector described as someone humming. A tune none of them could identify. The third pattern is visual. Shadows that do not match their sources. Movement in peripheral vision that stops when looked at directly. Shapes in the upper floors of collapsed buildings that are there for a moment and then are not. Raiders have a phrase for this. They say the ruins are dreaming. It is not a comforting phrase, and it was not meant to be. It started as a joke between a raider team who came back from a particularly disorienting run and needed language for what they had experienced. It stuck because it was accurate in a way that more clinical language was not. The ruins are doing something up there. Dreaming is as good a word as any for a process you can perceive but not understand. Now I want to talk about something specific. There is a sector of the surface that has been informally named the Quiet District by the raiders, who operate in that region. The formal designation is different and less memorable, and nobody uses it. The Quiet District is a stretch of old urban infrastructure that took particularly heavy bombardment early in the Ark period. The buildings that are still standing are structurally compromised. The ones that fell are stacked on top of each other in ways that create a dense network of interior spaces underneath the rubble. It is extremely resource-rich. It is also the sector with the highest raider loss rate of any mapped area in that region. The loss rate is not primarily from Ark encounters. That is the data point that stands out. In most sectors, casualties are predominantly Ark-related. Contact with an entity, proximity to a drop impact, equipment failure during an evasion. The Quiet District is different. In the Quiet District, casualties are categorized as unknown cause at a significantly higher rate than anywhere else on the mapped surface. Unknown cause means the raider did not come back, and there is no usable data about what happened to them. No last transmission, no recovered equipment, no witnesses. They went in and did not come out, and the search teams that went after them found nothing. There is one story from the Quiet District that gets told in almost every settlement that has raiders operating in that region. It has the quality of an urban legend, which means it has probably been embellished over retelling, but the core of it traces back to a documented account from a raider named Olsen, who operated there roughly 4 years into the Ark period. Olsen was retrieving something specific, a piece of equipment from a pre-Ark research station that had been identified as potentially useful. The station was deep in the Quiet District, which meant going through a lot of collapsed interior before getting to it. Olsen reached the station and retrieved the equipment. On the way out, she encountered something in one of the interior passages. Her account of it is careful and specific, which is part of why it is trusted. She was not prone to exaggeration. Her previous field logs were dry, practical documents. What she described was a figure, human in shape, standing in the passage ahead of her at the edge of her light's range. She stopped. It stopped. She called out, assuming it was another raider, possibly lost or injured. No response. She moved forward. It did not move away. As she got closer, she realized that it was not behaving the way a person would behave when approached in the dark by someone with a light. It was not covering its eyes. It was not turning toward her voice. It was just standing there, facing her. And as she got close enough to see it clearly, she realized it did not have a face. Let me be precise about what Olsen meant by that. Not that it was wearing something over its face. Not that the face was damaged or obscured. The surface of its head where a face should have been was smooth. Not featureless, in the way a mannequin is featureless, but smooth in the way a wall is smooth. Continuous with the skull in a way that suggested there had never been anything there. She stared at it for a moment that she estimated in her log as probably about 4 seconds, but felt much longer. Then she walked past it. She said it did not move as she passed. She felt it turn, not saw, felt. The air changed direction the way it does when a large body rotates. She did not look back. She walked to the exit, and she came out, and she filed the report, and she never went back into the Quiet District again. Olsen's account was reviewed and she was evaluated by the settlement's medical staff. They found nothing physically wrong with her. Psychologically, she scored within normal ranges on every assessment they ran, with one exception. She showed a consistent and elevated response to any image of a human face presented from the front. Specifically, she reacted to them as though they were slightly wrong before correcting herself. The evaluating physician noted that it looked like a recognition error, like her brain had updated its expectation of what a face should look like, based on recent experience, and needed a moment to recalibrate when it saw a real one. That note was filed alongside her account, and both were flagged for ongoing review. 3 other raiders have described encounters in the Quiet District that match Olsen's account in the core detail. Human shape, no face, present but not aggressive. Standing in an interior passage or in the shadow of collapsed structures. Facing the raider but not reacting to approach or sound. All 3 of those accounts were filed independently, and none of the raiders involved were in contact with each other at the time. The no-face figures, as they have started to be called in informal settlement conversation, do not appear in any Ark taxonomy that the research division has produced. They do not match the behavior profile of any known Ark entity. They do not match the profile of any human survivor condition. They are their own category, a category that has a name but no explanation. There is a theory that circulates among the more analytically minded raiders. It suggests that the no-face figures are an imprint. The idea being that the surface, under prolonged Ark bombardment, has absorbed something from the repeated exposures. Not radiation in the conventional sense, something else. And that something else, the theory goes, produces approximations of the things that used to be there. Approximations that are close, but not correct, human-shaped because humans were the most abundant, complex organism on the pre-Ark surface, but not quite right because whatever process generates them does not have full information. It is working from an impression rather than a template. This theory has no scientific support. It is nonetheless the explanation that makes people most comfortable, which is interesting in itself, because it is not particularly comforting as theories go. The surface changes over time. This is documented. The topography shifts. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the raiders who have been working the same sectors for years describe significant changes in the physical landscape that have nothing to do with recent drops. Passages that were open are now blocked. Spaces that were blocked have opened. One raider documented a building that had partially collapsed on one of their visits and was, on a subsequent visit, several months later, partially upright again. Not fully restored, not dramatically different, just subtly more intact than it had been. She photographed it. The research division confirmed that the images showed a difference. The explanation remains provisional. The leading hypothesis is some kind of slow mechanical process driven by arc entity activity in the area. The runner-up hypothesis is something nobody in the research division wants to put in a formal report. Let me talk about something called the blue hour. This is a surface phenomenon that a significant number of raiders have documented and that the settlement's atmospheric research team has spent considerable time on without arriving at a consensus explanation. The blue hour is exactly what it sounds like. There is a period, irregular in timing and duration, but typically lasting between 20 minutes and an hour, during which the light on the surface shifts to a specific quality of blue. Not the blue of sky or water, a different blue, one that raiders consistently describe as wrong in a way they have difficulty articulating. The light during the blue hour comes from everywhere, not from a point source, not from the sky specifically, from everywhere. The blue hour is associated with elevated reports of disorientation. Raiders who encounter it describe difficulty with spatial reasoning, trouble remembering which direction they came from, a sense that the layout of the ruins around them has changed. One raider team that was caught in an extended blue hour event of approximately 40 minutes reported that when the light returned to normal, they were in a section of the ruins that none of them had any memory of entering. Not a section they had passed through and forgotten. A section that was, by the best reconstruction the settlement could make, on the opposite side of the sector from where they had last been certain of their position. The team was intact, no injuries, no missing members, no explanation. The blue hour has never been recorded in the same location twice. This is significant because almost everything else about arc behavior shows some degree of territorial consistency. Entities return to areas, drop patterns cluster, but the blue hour seems to move. Or rather, it does not seem to be location-based at all. It appears where it appears, and then does not reappear there. Some researchers think this suggests it is associated with something mobile rather than something environmental, something that passes through an area, and the blue hour is a byproduct of its presence. What that something might be is unresolved. No raider has reported seeing anything unusual during the blue hour other than the light itself. I want to mention one more surface phenomenon before I move into the first full story of this collection. It is the one I find most interesting, and it is the one that took me longest to find in the records because it is not labelled as a phenomenon. It is just there in the field logs, mentioned incidentally, mentioned consistently, mentioned by raiders who had no reason to be coordinating on their accounts. It is this: the ruins smell different at night, not in a way that can be attributed to temperature change or moisture or anything the atmospheric team has been able to pin down. Different in a way that raiders describe as familiar, a smell like a specific place from before, like a house or a grocery store or a school, something that activates memory in a way that is precise and personal and should not be possible given that the surface does not know what you remember. Multiple raiders have described smelling something specific, something from their own past, something that they recognized. And the recognition was not vague, it was exact. One raider described the smell of her childhood kitchen, specific to a dish her mother cooked, for which the primary ingredient was not something that would occur naturally in a ruin. She said the smell lasted for about 30 seconds and was as strong as if she was standing in the kitchen. When it faded, she said she felt, and this is the word she used, witnessed. Not scared, not comforted, witnessed. Like whatever generated the smell had looked at a part of her that she had not consciously brought to the surface with her. That is the word I keep coming back to as we get into these stories. Witnessed. Because so much of what raiders describe from the surface has that quality. The sense of being seen by something that should not be able to see you. Something that is not looking at your body, but at something deeper. The surface is not just a dangerous place. The raiders who have spent the most time up there are consistent on this. It is a place that pays attention. Whatever the Ark has done to it over the years of bombardment, whatever process has changed the light and the smell and the shadows, the result is a surface that is aware. Not in a way that is verifiable or scientific, but aware in the way that very old places sometimes are. The way that a place holds the weight of everything that has happened there, and eventually that weight starts to press back. Now, let me tell you about Raider Team Callaway. Callaway was a 4-person team that operated out of a mid-sized settlement for about 2 years. They were known for taking long-range runs. Most Raider teams keep to sectors within a reasonable distance of their settlement access point. Callaway went further, not recklessly. They were methodical about it. They planned their extended runs carefully, brought extra supplies, filed detailed route plans. Their research before each run was thorough. They had a good safety record for the first year and a half. And then they filed a route plan for a run into a sector that the settlement had a soft prohibition on. Not a hard ban, a soft prohibition, a flag in the system that said this area is not recommended, and here are the documented reasons why. The documented reasons for the soft prohibition on that sector were threefold. First, the sector had an anomalously high rate of radio interference. Transmissions in and out of the sector were unreliable. This alone would have kept most teams out. Second, the sector had been the site of a significant Ark event roughly 18 months prior. Not just a drop, which are common, but an event, something larger, something that left a mark on the sector that the survey drones had picked up images of, but had not been close enough to fully document. Third, and this one was listed without further detail, which is itself a detail worth noting, prior raider activity in the sector. That was the full extent of the third reason. Prior raider activity. No further explanation. Callaway got clearance to do a reconnaissance run, not a full resource extraction, just eyes on. They would go in, assess, come back. They filed their route plan and their estimated return window, and they went up. The first transmission came through fine. Second location check, fine. Third was interrupted by interference, which was expected. The fourth did not come. The settlement waited past the transmission window, and then past the return window, and then dispatched a 4-person search team. The search team found Callaway's access point, undisturbed on the surface side. They found one set of boot prints in the dust near the access point, which suggested one person had returned to the surface entry at some point. Just one. And the boot prints were overlapping, which the search team's log noted, suggested the same person had paced there for some time before the prints ended. The prints ended. They did not continue in any direction. They were there, multiple overlapping impressions, and then they were not. No scuff marks indicating a fall, no drag marks indicating someone pulling the person away, no prints going somewhere else. They were there, and then they were not. The search team searched the sector for 3 days. They found 2 of Callaway's equipment caches, both empty, which meant the team had been active long enough to reach them. They found a stretch of wall in a collapsed interior space that had writing on it. The writing was in a handwriting style that the settlement's analysis team matched to one of the Callaway team members, a raider named Poe. The writing said, Do not look for us where you would look for someone lost. Look for us where things go when they are no longer lost, but have become something else. I want to be honest that this account has some contested elements. The handwriting match was based on a limited sample. The interpretation of the message is obviously open, but it is in the record and it is sourced and it is part of the collection of accounts that form the picture of the surface that I am trying to give you. Poe's message, if it was Poe's, suggests a state of awareness at the time of writing. It is not a distress message. It is not a goodbye. It reads as information, specific, directed information from someone who knew they were going somewhere and knew that the conventional search framework would not find them there. That is not what happens to lost raiders. Lost raiders call for help, or they go silent because something happened to them. They do not leave navigational instructions for a destination that cannot be found on any map. The last thing I want to mention about Callaway before moving on is this. The settlement's records show that approximately 6 weeks after the search was closed, the settlement received a transmission on the raider frequency. The transmission was brief and clear, no interference, which was notable given the sector it originated from. It was voice transmission. The voice was identified by the settlement's communications team as belonging to the Callaway team's leader, a raider named Daria Marchetti. The transmission said, "We found something." That was the full content. 3 words, clearly spoken, then silence. Follow-up transmissions to that frequency received no response. The origin point could not be pinpointed. The communications team logged the transmission as received and unverifiable, and it sits in the archive alongside everything else from the Callaway case, unremarked on and unresolved. We found something. That is the sentence I want to leave with you as we go into the next chapter. Because it is ambiguous in a specific way. It could be good news. Finding something is often the goal. Raiders go out to find things. But the transmission came from a team that had been missing for weeks, in a sector that nobody should have been transmitting from clearly, and it said we found something in a tone that the communications operator who received it described, off the record, as neither excited nor afraid. Just informational. The way you would tell someone about a thing that had happened to you that was so far outside the frame of what you had expected that the emotional response had not caught up yet. We found something. The current working interpretation in the settlement is that this means the team is alive and in contact with an arc entity or structure in the sector. The current non-working interpretation, the one that people think and do not say, is something else entirely. Before we move to Chapter 2, I want to say something directly. If you are listening to this while you're trying to fall asleep, I hope that these stories settle into your mind in the way that the best, uncertain things do, not as nightmares, but as questions. The surface in Ark Raiders is a place that has been broken and remade by something that does not communicate in any language we have found yet. The stories coming out of it are the only language we have for what that breaking and remaking has produced. They are incomplete. They are sometimes contradictory. They are, in the end, human stories told by people who went somewhere they were not supposed to go and tried to bring back some account of what they found. That is all these stories are. That and the word Daria Marchetti spoke across a dead channel 6 weeks after she went missing. We found something. Chapter 2, The Last Signal. There is a particular kind of archive that most large settlements maintain, though the format varies and the access restrictions vary even more. It is the archive of last transmissions. The final radio contact from raider teams that did not come back. Most of these transmissions are brief. A position check, a supply update, sometimes an alarm call that cuts off mid-sentence. They are logged, tagged and stored. Settlement communications officers review them as part of their ongoing assessment of sector danger levels. Occasionally, something useful comes out of them. A warning about a new arc movement pattern. Evidence of a resource cache that a subsequent team might be sent to retrieve. Mostly, they are documentation. Proof that someone was there and then was not. The archive I want to focus on in this chapter belongs to a raider team that operated under the call sign White Line. 3 members, all experienced. Their final mission was a scheduled extraction run into a sector that had been partially surveyed the previous season. They had done work in adjacent sectors before and had good familiarity with the general area. Their route plan was approved. Their equipment checks were signed off. They went up on a clear surface window, meaning the most recent drop pattern suggested minimal arc activity in their operational area for the next several hours. White Line was not a team that took unnecessary risks. Their record reflects that consistently. What happened to them is not a story about a team that did something wrong. The first transmission came at the scheduled 15-minute mark and was entirely normal. White Line's leader, a raider the record's name only as Lev, reported position and conditions in the terse standard format. Surface conditions moderate. No arc contact, proceeding along planned route. There was nothing in the transmission that a communications officer monitoring at the time would have flagged. The voice was level. The content was accurate according to the route plan they had filed. If you listened to it without knowing what came next, you would hear an ordinary check-in from an ordinary raider team doing their job on an ordinary surface run. There is something almost painful about that in retrospect. Normalcy has its own form of contrast. The second transmission was also on schedule and also normal. Position update, weather observation, a note that they had located the first secondary cache point on their route and were moving toward the primary extraction target. Lev's voice had the same flat professional quality as the first transmission. His 2 team members spoke briefly in the background of one segment, a low exchange that the Communications Archive's enhanced audio reconstruction partially captured. One of them was saying something about a smell. The word that the reconstruction picked up was wrong. Wrong smell. The comment was incidental, part of a conversation that Lev was not engaged in, and the communications officer monitoring the channel at the time did not note it in their log. The third transmission came 2 minutes late, not dramatically late. Not enough to trigger a check-in protocol. 2 minutes, but it was the first deviation from White Line's pattern, and in retrospect the Communications Archive review team flagged it as the first data point. Lev's voice in this transmission was the same as before in tone, but the content was slightly different. He reported position normally, reported no arc contact normally, and then added, before signing off, that they were adjusting their route slightly due to a structural obstruction, a collapsed passage that had not been marked on the survey data. He said they were taking an alternate path around it and would update their route plan on return. Standard procedure, nothing alarming, except that the alternate route he briefly described would have taken them through a section of the sector that the previous season's survey team had flagged with a single annotation. Anomalous readings, further survey recommended. The fourth transmission did not come at the scheduled mark. It came 9 minutes late. The communications officer on duty at the time noted the delay and was reaching for the check-in protocol when the channel opened. The content of this transmission is where the archive review team spent most of their time. Lev opened with his position update, which was consistent with the adjusted route he had described, and then he said, "We have found something in the alternate passage." His tone on that sentence was different, not alarmed, different in the way that the Daria Marchetti transmission was different. Informational, but from a place that did not have an obvious emotional category for what it was informing about. He said, "It is not arc." He said, "It is not structural." He said, "We are going to take a closer look." And then the transmission closed normally. What White Line found in the alternate passage is described across the next 3 transmissions, which came at irregular intervals over the following 90 minutes. The description is fragmented because none of the transmissions were specifically about the find. Each one was ostensibly a routine check-in, and the information about what they were seeing was delivered in the same tone as position updates and surface condition reports. This made the descriptions feel even more dislocating when the archive team pieced them together. Lev described, across those 3 transmissions, what he called a room that was not a room, a space within the collapsed structures of the sector that had no apparent natural or structural explanation for its existence. A cleared area, roughly circular, with walls that were not walls, but were also not the rubble they had been traversing. Something between the two. Defined space, where defined space should not have been possible. The floor of the space was described as smooth, not polished, not manufactured, but smooth in the way that something becomes smooth through long repetitive contact. Worn. Lev did not speculate about what had worn it. He described it and moved on. The ceiling of the space was open at one point, which is how enough light reached it to be visible at all. Through that opening, Lev noted, you could see the sky, which sounds unremarkable until you consider that they were multiple structural layers below the surface at this point. To see the sky through an opening in what should have been solid layers of collapsed building was to see something that the physics of the space should not have allowed. The opening was circular. The sky through it was the blue hour blue. There was something in the centre of the space. Lev described it in 2 transmissions, and the descriptions were consistent with each other, which is significant because they were delivered 15 minutes apart, and in that 15 minutes something else had happened that I am going to get to. The object in the centre of the space was roughly the size and shape of a person sitting. Not sitting in a chair. Sitting the way a person sits when they are meditating, or the way a person sits when they are very tired and have sat down on the floor and drawn their knees up. Compact, self-contained. It was not a person. Lev was clear on that. He used the phrase approximately person-shaped, and then clarified that it was not a person and that it did not move when they entered the space. The second description of the object came after the team had been in the space for 15 minutes. In this description, Lev said that the object was smaller than they had initially thought. He said this matter-of-factly. He did not explain the discrepancy. He did not speculate that they had misjudged the initial size or that their perspective had been off. He said it as a plain observation. It is smaller than it was. His team member, a raider named Cass, could be heard in the background of this transmission. Cass was saying something that the audio reconstruction could not fully capture, but the reconstruction's best approximation of the phrase was, "It is still moving, Lev. It has not stopped moving." Lev did not address this in the transmission. The 5th transmission came with a new element. Lev was no longer in the same space. He said they had exited the room that was not a room and were proceeding toward the primary extraction target. His voice in this transmission was the flattest it had been in any of the recordings. Not calmer, flatter. There is a distinction that the archive review team struggled to articulate precisely. Calm has a quality of active suppression, of something that might surge if the suppression let up. Flat has no suppression because there is nothing underneath pressing up. Lev's voice was flat. He reported position. He reported that the extraction target was within range. He reported that Cass and his 3rd team member, a raider named Emmett, were both present and operational. He did not elaborate on what operational meant in context. The 6th transmission was the first one that the communications officer on duty immediately flagged. Not because of what Lev said, but because of what he did not say. The transmission opened normally. Position, conditions, no arc contact. And then there was a pause. The kind of pause that does not happen in radar transmissions because every second of dead air on an open channel is a second of potential interference, and radar training is to keep transmissions tight and clear. This pause lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds of open channel with what sounded like breathing and what the audio reconstruction identified as a very low, very slow sound that it could not classify, but that the review team described variously as mechanical, organic, and one member wrote in their review notes, "It sounds like something counting." After the 11 seconds, Lev said, "We found the extraction target." Then the transmission closed. The communications officer made a note in the log that said, Team Whiteline, possible psychological stress response, monitor. That note is standard for any transmission that shows a deviation from established communication patterns. It is not an emergency flag. It is a watch flag. The officer did the right thing by their protocol. What the protocol did not have a category for was what the next transmission would contain. The 7th transmission came 4 minutes later, which was well off schedule in either direction. It was not the routine check-in interval. It was not an emergency. 4 minutes is an odd gap because it is too soon for a scheduled check and too long for an emergency addendum to a just completed transmission. Lev's voice in this transmission had recovered some of its tonal variation. He sounded, for the first time since the 4th transmission, like a person rather than a recording of a person. He said, I need to relay some information. He said, Cass is asking me to relay this. He said, when we were in the room, the object looked at us. He paused again. Shorter this time, 3 seconds. Then, it does not have eyes, we are all certain of that. But when it looked at us, we could feel it, in the chest. He paused again. Then, Emmett wants you to know that he is still himself. He said those exact words. Then the transmission closed. The communications officer flagged the 7th transmission for elevated review and sent an immediate message to the settlement's radar operations coordinator. The coordinator reviewed the log within 20 minutes and made the decision to initiate a check-in call to Whiteline's frequency. The check-in call was made, no response. Standard protocol from that point is a waiting period of 30 minutes, followed by a second call, followed by escalation to search preparation if the second call also receives no response. The second call received no response. Escalation was initiated. The timeline from Lev's 7th transmission to the point at which a search team was being assembled was approximately 75 minutes. While the search team was being assembled, the archive received 2 more transmissions from Whiteline's channel. These were not communications to the settlement. They were picked up by a passive monitoring system that logs all activity on radar channels regardless of intended recipients. They were transmissions that Whiteline was making to each other, using their shared team channel rather than the settlement frequency. The monitoring system captured them, but they were not reviewed until the search team returned. When they were reviewed, they were immediately classified at the highest available sensitivity level and access was restricted. I have partial reconstruction of their content. The first of the captured team channel transmissions was from Cass. She was describing something she was seeing in present tense in real time. The description is fragmented because the channel quality was poor, but the reconstruction recovered several clear phrases. One of them was, "It is not getting smaller anymore." Another was, "It is the same size it started," which in context with Lev's earlier report that the object had been smaller than initially observed, suggests the object had either stopped changing size or had changed again, returning to its original dimensions. The third phrase the reconstruction recovered from Cass's transmission was, "I think it is breathing Emmett. I think that is what that sound is." And then the channel closed. The second captured team channel transmission was from Emmett. It was brief. The reconstruction is nearly complete for this one because the channel quality was briefly clear. Emmett said, "If we bring any of this back, we need to make sure we know what we're bringing." Then a pause, then, "I am not sure Lev is ready to leave." Then a longer pause during which there was ambient sound that the reconstruction identified as footsteps, and then the sound of someone speaking in a way that was not captured clearly enough to reconstruct. Then Emmett said in a quieter voice, "Lev, we need to go." And then the channel closed, and that was the last transmission of any kind from Whiteline. The search team reached the sector the following morning. They found Whiteline's access point undisturbed. They found the primary extraction target, which was a resource cache in a partly intact building about 800 meters into the sector. The cache had been opened. Some of its contents had been removed and placed in a radar carry sack that was left beside it. The sack was full. White Line had been here and had done the job they came to do. From the extraction cache, the search team followed the most logical return path toward the access point and found no sign of the team. They then tried to locate the alternate route Lev had taken, and this is where the search became complicated. The alternate route did not exist, or rather, the passage that Lev had described taking around the structural obstruction was not where the route plan and his position updates indicated it should have been. The obstruction was there, a collapsed passage, exactly as Lev had described. The alternate path around it was not. The section of ruins where the alternate path should have been was an impassable tangle of structural debris that the search team's pathfinders assessed as having been that way for a long time. Not recently collapsed, not recently moved, long-standing, which raised the question of how White Line had navigated through it at all, and whether the position data in their transmissions had been accurate. The search team found the room that was not a room on their second day in the sector, not by following White Line's route, which they could not reconstruct, by accident, essentially. One of the search team's members was checking an adjacent passage for any sign of the White Line team and fell through a structurally compromised floor section. She landed in a cleared space below, circular, with walls she described in her report as not quite walls, with a floor that was smooth, with an opening in what should have been a solid ceiling, through which the sky was visible. She was unhurt, she called up to her team, and while she waited for them to reach her via an alternate route, she stood in the space and looked at the centre of it, where there was nothing. No object, no approximately person-shaped anything. Just the worn, smooth floor and the column of light from the opening above, falling on nothing. The raider who had fallen into the space filed a detailed report of what she observed there. Most of it matched Lev's description, closely enough to confirm that it was the same location. The smooth floor, the ceiling opening, the dimensions. What she added that Lev had not described was a smell. She said the space smelled like a room that many people had been in for a long time. Not unclean, not like sweat or decay, like accumulated habitation, the warm, dense air quality of a room that has been occupied consistently. She said it was the most inhabited feeling space she had ever been in that did not currently have any people in it. She said she felt very strongly that whatever had been in the centre of that space had been there for a very long time, not as a recent visitor, as a resident. The search team found no trace of White Line in the sector. They searched for 3 days. They found White Line's carry sack of extracted resources where it had been left beside the cache. They found boot prints consistent with a 3-person team moving through several sections of the ruins, though the prints were irregular in ways that the search team's tracker noted without fully explaining. Irregular stride patterns, distances between prints that suggested the 3 people had been moving at significantly different speeds at different points, in ways that did not correlate with terrain. At one point, the prints converged, 3 sets of prints coming from different directions and meeting in a single location, and from that convergence point there was only 1 set of prints continuing onward. The single set of prints that continued from the convergence point was followed by the search team for about 200 metres before they reached a section of the ruins where the floor surface changed and prints were no longer possible to read. The tracker noted that the single set of prints had a different gait pattern than any of the 3 individual patterns that had converged. Not a combination of them, not one of them. Different. The stride was longer, more even. The tracker's note said, the prints leading away from the convergence point were made by someone who knew exactly where they were going and was not hurrying and was not hesitating. The settlement made something of all this. They did not close the White Line case as missing, presumed dead, which is the standard closure for a failed raider mission after a search comes up empty. They classified it differently. The classification used was missing, status indeterminate, case maintained. It is one of 4 cases in that settlement's history with that classification. The other 3 all involve circumstances that the settlement's records describe as involving unresolved anomalous contact. The white line classification puts them in a category of 4. 4 cases in the settlement's entire operational history where the outcome of a raider mission was considered too uncertain to close even after a full search returned empty. There is a postscript to the white line case that I want to include because I think it changes the texture of the whole thing. Several months after the search was closed, one of the search team members, the raider who had fallen through the floor into the circular space, submitted an addendum to her original report. She had not filed the addendum immediately because she had not been certain of what she was reporting. She had wanted time to think about it. The addendum described something she had noticed while she was standing in the space waiting for her team to reach her. Something she had seen in the column of light from the ceiling opening. She had been looking up through the opening at the sky when she noticed that the light falling through the opening was casting a shadow in the space below. The shadow was shaped like a person, cast in the wrong direction relative to the actual light source, which should not have been possible, thrown across the smooth floor of the space in a direction that had no physical correspondence to the opening above. A person shadow in the wrong place, from the wrong angle. She had stared at it for approximately 30 seconds. During those 30 seconds, the shadow had not moved. She had noted it, and then her team had arrived, and she had climbed out and had not thought about it again until later, when she was trying to sleep, and could not stop thinking about the specifics of the wrong angle. She calculated it in her head several times. The angle from the shadow to the theoretical light source, it implied, pointed in a direction that was, she concluded, consistent with a light source that was below the floor of the space, not above it. The shadow was cast by a light coming from below the smooth floor, below the cleared circular space, below whatever layers of compressed rubble and dead infrastructure separated that space from whatever was under it. The raider who filed the addendum included a note at the end that said she was not making a claim about what was below the space. She was reporting an observation. The shadow was there, and it was shaped like a person, and it was cast by something underneath. She said she had not stepped on the floor of the space after noticing this, though she was not sure why the distinction had felt important. She had stayed near the wall that she had fallen against, near the edge, and she had kept her weight off the centre of the floor for the rest of her time in the space. She had not been able to articulate why at the time. She still could not fully articulate it. It just felt wrong to step on a floor that something was under. The white line case and the room that was not a room point towards something that I think is worth naming directly. They suggest the possibility that there are spaces within the arc-altered surface that are not ruins in the conventional sense, not damaged buildings waiting to be stripped for parts. Something else. Something that is its own thing, maintained for its own purposes, by something that is neither human nor arc in the taxonomy that the settlements currently use. The room is a third category, and the white line team may have been the first people to spend enough time in a third category space to learn something about it. What they learned is not fully clear, but the evidence suggests they understood that learning was happening, that they were in the process of finding something out. Whether what they found out was something they had a choice about knowing, or whether the finding out was done to them rather than by them, is one of the questions the case does not answer. Now let me bring in a second case that connects to the white line account in a way I find significant. This case involves a raider named Tova, who operated independently, without a team, which is unusual and carries a significantly elevated risk rating. Solo raiding is not prohibited in most settlements, but it is strongly discouraged, and the equipment requirements for solo runs include additional communication redundancy. Tova was not reckless. She had operated solo for 2 years without incident. She chose solo work because she found the coordination overhead of team operations slowed her down, and she was fast enough on her own to stay within her safety windows without the safety net of a team. She knew the risk calculation. She chose it with full information. Tova's account is relevant here because she also encountered an anomalous space. Not the same space as the White Line room, a different space in a different sector with a different geometry, but with enough shared characteristics to suggest a pattern. Tova's space was not circular. It was long and narrow, almost like a corridor, but with a ceiling height that was inconsistent, soaring in some sections, low enough to crouch under in others. The floor was smooth, same as White Line's room. The walls were that in-between state, defined but not quite structural. There was no ceiling opening, no natural light source, but there was light. Tova described it as sourceless illumination, consistent with what other raiders in other contexts have described during the Blue Hour, but confined to this space and not associated with any particular colour. Just light from everywhere, that had no origin point she could identify. Tova spent a significant amount of time in this space. This is the element of her account that most distinguishes it from the White Line account. White Line was in the room that was not a room for a limited period, and then left. Tova stayed. She was not trapped. She could have left at any point. She chose to stay. She said in her account, which she filed as a written document rather than a verbal transmission log, that the space felt like the first place she'd been in a long time that was not doing anything to her. Not the ruins, which feel hostile or indifferent. Not the settlement, which presses with its population and its noise and its constant requirement that you be something functional in relation to other people. The anomalous space was just there. Tova said it was the most restful 4 hours she could remember spending anywhere. She spent 4 hours in the space. She filed this in her report without apparent embarrassment, which is itself notable. Raiders do not typically admit to sitting in the ruins for 4 hours for non-operational reasons. The stigma around psychological weakness on the surface is significant because the surface is where psychological weakness gets you killed, and the culture that develops around that reality does not have much patience for behaviour that cannot be justified operationally. Tova said, "I know how this looks." She said it directly in the report. Then she said, "I am telling you anyway because I think you should know these spaces exist and what it feels like to be in one." What Tova described about the 4 hours she spent in the space is difficult to summarise without losing something. She described a quality of time that was different from normal time. Not faster or slower, different in its texture. She said there were moments where she was not sure whether she was awake or asleep, but that the uncertainty was not frightening. She said there were sounds in the space that were not there when she first entered, but that she could not clearly identify as having arrived at any point. They were just there, and then they had been there for a while, and she was not sure when they had started. She described the sounds as similar to a conversation she could not quite hear. Not words, the pattern of words, the rhythm of language without any of its content. Tova left the space when her safety timer alarm activated. She had set the alarm before entering, and she was glad she had, because she was not sure she would have remembered to leave otherwise. She said the process of leaving was strange. Not that the space was reluctant to let her go, more that the transition back to the normal ruins was abrupt in a way that normal transitions between spaces are not, like a cut in an audio recording rather than a fade. Inside the space and then immediately outside it, with no perceptual middle ground. She stood in the ruins outside the space for a few seconds, disoriented, recalibrating, and then she heard something from inside the space from behind her. She described it as footsteps, not heavy, light, moving toward the entrance she had just exited through. From inside the space, she walked away. She did not look back. She does not know what reached the entrance after her, or if anything reached it. She did not look. Tova's report and the White Line case share enough specific details that the Settlement's Research Division eventually connected them. Smooth floor, defined space in locations where such definition should not be possible, sourceless quality to the light, a sense of extended presence or occupation, and in both cases, something there, something in Whiteline's room, footsteps in Tova's corridor. The research division's note on the connection was brief and careful. It said, possible structural category, not arc-associated by known behavioural markers. Further documentation required. That note was filed and the further documentation requirement was logged, but not specifically actioned. There is no evidence that any structured effort was made to investigate the anomalous spaces. The settlements do not have resources to spare on phenomena that are not immediately threatening, and neither the room nor the corridor had shown any behaviour that could be described as a direct threat. I want to linger on that last point. Not immediately threatening. Neither space had harmed anyone. Whiteline went missing, yes, but they went missing after leaving the room, not in it. Tova came back from the corridor fine, more than fine, arguably better rested than she had been in months. The anomalous spaces are not, by the available evidence, predatory. They are something. They are inhabited or have been inhabited. They produce effects in the people who enter them. But they do not attack. They do not detain. They do not, as far as any documentation shows, do anything to anyone that the person in question experienced as hostile. This matters for how we categorize them, and the fact that we currently do not have a category for them matters for what happens next time a raider team falls through a floor into one and does not know what it is. There is one more element of Tova's account I want to include before moving on. At the end of her written report, after all the careful descriptions and the acknowledgement that she knew how it looked and the alarm timer note, she added a single paragraph that was formatted differently from the rest, slightly indented, as though she was unsure whether it belonged in the report. She wrote that when she was in the space, in one of the moments where she was uncertain whether she was awake or asleep, she had a very clear and specific impression that something in the space was looking at something she had brought with her, not at her, past her or through her at something she was carrying. She went through her equipment afterward, checking everything. She did not find anything unusual. Whatever the space had been interested in, she had taken it with her when she left. The specificity of the Whiteline and Continue 1336 Tova accounts and the way they reinforce each other is why I'm giving them this much time in the collection. They are not the most dramatic stories in the archive. Nobody has a face dissolved or gets pulled through a wall. What they have instead is a quality of precision and consistency that I find harder to dismiss than the more extreme accounts. Lev, who transmitted flat-voiced observations about a shrinking object in a space that should not have existed. Tova, who sat for 4 hours in a corridor full of sourceless light and conversation-shaped sound. The search raider, who noticed a shadow being cast by something under the floor. These are people describing something they were careful about describing, something that did not fit any frame they had available, and so they tried to give you the raw observations instead, and trusted you to do something with them. What I want to do with them is this. I want to suggest that the Ark Raiders world contains spaces that are not Ark, are not human, are not ruins in the ordinary sense, spaces that are maintained in some functional way by something that has been there for a while and has interest of some kind and a way of being present that does not correspond to anything in the current taxonomy. These spaces are discoverable. Raiders have found them accidentally. They will find more. And what happens when someone finds one and stays long enough to learn something is a question that the Whiteline case opens without fully closing. We found something. That is still the last clear transmission. We found something, and whatever they found changed the signature of their boot prints and led them somewhere that a 3-day search could not locate. That is the full extent of what the record gives us. The rest is the silence on the channel, and the light from below the floor, and the footsteps in Tova's corridor moving toward the exit after she had gone through it. Chapter 3. The Ones Who Come Back. different of all the categories in the settlement archives that deal with surface-related anomalies, the one that gets the least formal documentation and the most informal discussion is the one that deals with raiders who come back wrong. This is not a clinical term, it is the term that settlements use when they are talking about it outside of official reports. Come back wrong. The official terminology varies by settlement but tends toward language like post-exposure behavioral deviation or neurological adjustment period, which are phrases designed to keep the subject in the medical domain and out of the more unsettling interpretive space that the informal language opens. What does it mean to come back wrong? The range of presentations is wide enough that it almost resists categorization, and yet there is a consistent core to it. Raiders who have come back wrong are, first and most importantly, still raiders. They function. They go out, they come back, they do their jobs. Most of them pass initial reintegration assessments without any flag. The wrongness surfaces over time, and it surfaces in specific ways. Patterns of behavior or cognition that are new, that did not exist before the relevant surface run, and that cannot be attributed to injury or ordinary psychological stress. Patterns that feel to the people around them like something has changed in the fundamental way the person is oriented toward the world. The first presentation type is the most common and the most subtle. It is a change in how the raider relates to other people, not in a way that reads as withdrawal or trauma-related social difficulty, more like a shift in scale. As if the raider now operates from a different frame of reference than the people around them, one in which individual human interactions are legible but feel somehow smaller than they used to. Raiders with this presentation are not unkind. They are not cold, they are attentive, sometimes more attentive than before. But they are attentive in the way that someone is attentive to something that is not quite the thing they are primarily attending to, like they are watching you while looking at something else. The second presentation type involves the senses, specifically an apparent heightening or expansion of some sensory capacity, most commonly hearing or smell, that does not have a medical explanation. Raiders report hearing things that are not there, or not yet there, in ways that turn out to be accurate. They smell things before they are detectable by any other person in the same space. One raider's medical record documents that she correctly identified the approach of an arc entity in a surface scan, drill by smell, from a distance at which no other sensory input should have been available. When asked how, she said, "It smells like the room where I learned something." She could not or would not elaborate on what that meant. The third presentation type is the one that generates the most discomfort in the settlements and the most restriction in the archives. Some raiders who come back wrong start over time to demonstrate knowledge they should not have. Not arc pattern knowledge or surface geography knowledge. Personal knowledge. Knowledge about the people around them, about things that happened before the raiders' time, about the histories of the settlements in ways that exceed what they were told or could have learned. One raider named Desic, whose case is among the most documented in this category, correctly identified the operational code name of a mission that had been classified at the highest level before he joined his settlement. He identified it casually, in passing, in a conversation about something unrelated. When challenged, he looked genuinely confused and said he had assumed it was general knowledge. Desic's case is worth spending time on because it developed over a longer period than most and left a richer paper trail. He came back from a solo run in his third year of raiding with nothing unusual in his immediate post-run assessment. Healthy, cognitively normal by every metric they tested. The changes were gradual. Over the following months, the people who worked with him began to notice that he seemed to anticipate events, not in a dramatic, claimed prophecy way, in a quiet, preparatory way. He would have equipment ready before it was requested. He would be in the right place at the right time in ways that accumulated into something notable. He mentioned things he should not have known. He was unable, when asked, to explain how he knew them. He was not evasive about this. He was cooperative with every interview, every assessment. He genuinely seemed not to know how he knew what he knew. The settlement's medical team ran a full cognitive evaluation on Desic at the 8-month mark after his return. The evaluation found nothing pathological. His memory, reasoning, and perception scores were all within normal range. Above average in some areas, the same as they had always been in others. The evaluating physician noted one anomaly. When Desic was presented with a set of photographs and asked to identify which ones were of real locations and which were fabricated, he performed perfectly on a significantly larger test set than was standard. Not just on the real or fabricated distinction, but on a secondary set that asked him to identify which real locations had seen significant arc activity. He had no particular specialized knowledge of the test sites. He had never been to most of them. His performance was not something the standard scale had a number for. When the physician asked him how he knew which sites had seen arc activity, Desic was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They feel heavier." He gestured at the photographs. He said, "The places where it has been longer are heavier." The physician asked him to elaborate. He said, "I do not know how to make this more precise. It is a quality. The photographs have it to different degrees. The places where the arc has been, specifically the ones where it has been many times, or for a long time, they feel like they are carrying something." He paused. He said, "The way I feel sometimes, like I am carrying something that was not in my pack when I went up." What Desic carried with him after his return is not described in any document I found. The medical record notes his interview responses, but does not pursue the thread of the carrying something metaphor. The settlement's operations division cleared him to continue raiding after the evaluation, noting that his anomalous sensory capacities might have operational value. This is a pragmatic response. The settlements are not in a position to sideline functional, capable raiders because of changes that do not impair function. They needed him. He kept going up. His run record from that point forward shows a perfect return rate, which is exceptional for any raider, let alone one operating in high-risk sectors. He never came back wrong again. He was already as wrong as he was going to get, apparently, and whatever had changed in him had stabilized into something that worked in both directions, something that knew the surface and that the surface knew. I want to talk about a specific incident from Desic's later operational period because it connects to something larger. About 14 months after his return from the run that changed him, Desic was part of a team operating in a mid-risk sector when they encountered another raider team that was in distress. The second team had been caught in a Blue Hour event and had become disoriented and separated. 2 of their 4 members were missing. The 2 that remained were not injured, but were in a state of significant cognitive confusion. They could not orient themselves and had been circling the same section of ruins for an extended period. Desic found them. Found the 2 missing members specifically, who had wandered considerably further from the Blue Hour origin zone than anyone would have predicted based on their last known positions. He found them by, in his account, following something he could not describe precisely. A quality of the air, he said. A weight distribution in the sector that pointed toward where they were. His team leader's account of this describes Desic stopping at a point where there were no visible indicators of the missing raiders and saying, "They are that way," and walking directly to them in approximately 8 minutes. Both missing raiders were uninjured and in the same disoriented cognitive state as their teammates. When the full team was reunited and the cognitive state of the Blue Hour exposure victims was assessed, the settlement's medical team found something interesting. Desic also showed markers of the Blue Hour cognitive exposure, even though he had not been in the event zone. Minor markers, significantly attenuated compared to the directly exposed raiders, but the signature was there. Whatever the Blue Hour does to the people caught in it, Desic had a trace of it just from being in the vicinity of the people who had been directly affected. The physician who noted this framed it carefully. She said it suggested a resonance condition. That Desic, after his return from the anomalous run, had developed some kind of ongoing resonance with arc-altered states. Not susceptibility in a dangerous sense, something more like tuning. He was tuned to the frequency. The comeback wrong category is not, in its majority, as functional as Desic. He is the end of a distribution. The middle of the distribution is raiders who function adequately but show enough change over time that the people around them become uncomfortable, and who eventually, in most cases, stop doing surface runs. Not because they're banned, but because the rhythm of their life reorients itself away from the settlement, and they begin spending more time up there and less time below. This pattern repeats in multiple settlement archives. Raiders who came back changed, who continued operating, who gradually shifted their centre of gravity toward the surface, who one day simply did not come back. Not in the way of dying, in the way of choosing. There is a term for this in some settlement traditions. It is not a formal term, and it is not universal, but it appears in enough independent records from enough geographically distinct settlements that I think it reflects a real pattern rather than a transmitted cultural idea. The term is walkers, raiders who have been changed by the surface and who have, gradually or suddenly, walked away from the underground and made their home up there among the ruins. The settlements have complicated feelings about walkers. There is grief, because these are people the settlements knew and worked alongside. There is practical concern, because experienced raiders are scarce and losing one to the surface is a material loss. And there is something else that the records capture in different ways, a mix of unease and something that might be called recognition, acknowledgement that the thing that took the walker was not entirely malign, that whatever the surface offered them, they accepted it knowingly, that it was, in some sense, a choice. One walker's story is documented in enough detail to be worth telling specifically. Her name was Isolde. She had been raiding for 6 years and had come back from a run in her 4th year, showing the first presentation type changes. The shift in scale. The quality of attending to something beyond the person she was talking to. She remained operationally active and effective for 2 more years. Then she came back from a run and told her settlement coordinator that she was going up one more time and was not planning to return. She was calm and clear and not distressed. She filed a final report, thorough as all her previous reports, organised her personal possessions and distributed them to people she wanted to have them, and went up on the next surface window. The settlement tried to stop her, not physically. They called her back on the channel. They sent a team to the access point to wait. She transmitted once from the surface, not to the settlement channel, but to a personal frequency that her closest colleague monitored. She said, "It does not feel like leaving. It feels like arriving." And then the frequency went quiet. The team at the access point waited past any reasonable return window and then went back to the settlement. Isolde's final report was reviewed by the research division, and it contained something that I think about often. In the section where raiders typically note anything unusual observed on the run, Isolde had written, "I have been counting, and the nights I have spent on the surface now outnumber the nights I have spent below." I did not decide this deliberately, but I notice that the count has crossed, and that the side it has crossed to is the one that feels more like home. Their sole documentation ended there. But there is an addendum filed by her colleague, the one who had monitored the personal frequency. The colleague wrote that approximately 4 months after Isolde went up and did not come back, they received a brief transmission on that same personal frequency. They had been monitoring it, they admitted in the addendum, hoping for something. The transmission was voice. It was clearly Isolde. She said, "I want you to know I am all right." And then after a pause, "All right is not exactly the right word. I am here." And then the transmission ended. The colleague noted that in Isolde's voice, during that transmission, there was a quality they had not heard before. Not the flat inflection of someone who has been traumatized past effect. Something fuller than that. Something that they struggled to name. They wrote in the final line of the addendum, she sounded like someone who was standing exactly where they had always meant to be. I want to tell you about one more case in this category before we move on, and this one is not a raider. It is a settlement physician, a woman named Dr. Haraya, who specialized in the medical assessment of returning raiders and who accumulated, over the years of her practice, a body of knowledge about the comeback wrong presentations that was almost certainly unique. She did not publish her full analysis. Parts of it are in her case files, which I reviewed in reconstructed form. What she wrote in those files reflects a mind that had spent years looking directly at a phenomenon that most people in her field preferred to view obliquely. Haraya's conclusion, stated plainly in a note at the back of a case file from her 7th year of practice, was this: the changes I observe in these patients are not damage. I have spent a long time trying to determine whether they are damage because damage is the framework I was trained to apply. But the more I have seen, the more certain I am that damage is the wrong category. The changes are not a subtraction. They are not a loss of function or capacity or connection. They are an addition. Something has been added to these people that they did not have before. The addition is not benign in the way that a vitamin is benign. It is significant. It changes how they move through the world, but it is not damage. It is contact that has left a residue. Haraya went on to write that her best model for what the residue was, drawing on years of observation, was a form of recognition. The raiders who came back changed had been recognized by something on the surface, picked out, attended to, and the attention had changed them in the way that being truly attended to sometimes changes people, at a scale and by a force that was not human, but that produced something recognizable in the people it touched. She wrote, I think the surface is not indifferent to us. I think it is extremely attentive, and I think the people who have spent the most time there have been noticed, the way that you might notice and become invested in an animal that keeps returning to the same space, in your garden. You start to know them, they start to know you. The relationship changes both parties. She paused there in the note and then added, I say this knowing that the scale of the comparison is badly wrong. The surface is not a garden. We are not animals that size. Haraya never went to the surface herself. She spent her career below, in the medical spaces of the settlement, attending to the people who came back. She wrote her concluding note, the one I have been quoting, in the last case file from her practice before she retired. She ended the note with something that I want to quote as precisely as I can reconstruct, because it feels like the most honest summary of everything this chapter has been circling. She wrote, I have spent many years trying to determine whether the surface makes people less human. I believe I was asking the wrong question. The right question, I think, is whether it makes them more of something else, something that includes what they were before, but is larger, something that takes the human they were and sets it inside a wider frame. Whether that wider frame is a gift or a loss or simply a fact, I cannot say with confidence. I have watched people walk into it willingly, knowing what they were choosing. I have watched people resist it and fail. I have watched people carry it gracefully, and people who were destroyed by it. What I have not watched, in all my years, is anyone who was touched by the surface, and then was exactly what they had been before. Contact leaves a mark, every time. The only variable is what the mark becomes. Chapter 4. What arc leaves. Behind the physical remnants of arc activity are not understudied. They are, in fact, among the most intensively studied phenomena in the settlements because understanding arc material is directly linked to survival. What arc entities leave behind when they move through an area, what the impacts of drops do to the environment, what the residue of entity activity consists of, and how it behaves over time, all of this has practical import, and the settlements have devoted significant resources to studying it. What I want to talk about is not that research. What I want to talk about is the other category, the things ARC leaves behind that the practical research does not fully account for. There is a document in a settlement archive that I found filed under the heading Theoretical Material Effects. It was written by a research analyst named Ose, who was part of a team that had been tasked with studying the long-term environmental effects of heavy arc bombardment in a particular sector. Their fieldwork involved multiple site visits over an extended period, which is unusual. Most surface research is snapshot-based, single visits with drone support, because the logistics of sustained surface presence are prohibitive. Ose's team had a specific mandate and the resources to pursue it, which is why their documentation is richer than most. Ose's document is divided into sections. The first two sections are technical and within the scope of normal ARC research: drop pattern analysis, material composition of entity residue, environmental changes in soil, and structural materials following sustained bombardment. All of what you would expect. It is in the third section that the document begins to do something different. The third section is titled Secondary Effects, and it opens with the sentence that the other members of Ose's team apparently objected to on the grounds that it was not within the scope of their research mandate. The sentence is, the sectors studied do not behave as inert environments. What Ose meant by this is developed carefully over the remainder of the document. The sectors do not behave as inert environments because they respond to presence, not in the way that environments respond mechanically to the people moving through them, in a way that suggests something closer to awareness. Ose was precise about not claiming sentience or intentionality. He did not claim the sectors knew people were there in any meaningful cognitive sense, but he documented enough specific, reproducible observations to support a weaker version of the claim. The sectors noticed people in some functional sense. Their behaviour changed in measurable ways when humans were present, and the nature of the change was not random. It was oriented. The specific observations Ose documented are worth going through. The first was temperature differential. In sectors with heavy arc history, the temperature in enclosed spaces was consistently slightly elevated compared to open areas. This is not surprising and is attributed in the standard literature to residual energy from entity activity. What Ose documented was that the temperature differential was not static. It shifted when people entered the spaces. The enclosed spaces became warmer when occupied. Not by a lot, not dramatically, but measurably, consistently, and in a way that correlated with the number of people in the space and their duration of presence. The spaces were, in some functional sense, responding to occupation. The second observation involved electromagnetic fields. The sectors showed ambient EM anomalies, which is again not unusual in heavily bombarded areas. What Ose's extended monitoring showed was that the ambient EM patterns in a given location changed during and after human presence. The patterns became, over time, more complex in areas with high radar activity, more structured, not in a way that the team could attribute to any physical equipment the raiders had left behind. The sectors themselves were accumulating structure. Something about repeated human presence was making the ambient EM of the space more elaborate. Ose's note on this was, "I do not know what this means. I am documenting it accurately." The third observation is the one that generated the most controversy when the document was reviewed internally. Ose had set up sensitive audio monitoring equipment at multiple sites and had collected extended recordings over the duration of the field research. When he analysed the recordings, he found something that his initial pass had not caught. Buried in the low-frequency range, below what human hearing picks up without equipment, the recordings from sites with the highest arc activity showed a periodic signal, not an arc entity communication signal, which the research team was equipped to identify. Something different, a signal that did not match any known arc source. that was structured enough to be non-random, that repeated with enough regularity to suggest intentionality, but with enough variation to resist a simple mechanical explanation. Osei submitted the audio files for analysis by multiple teams, and the consensus was that the signal was real and was not attributable to any known source. The analysis did not go further than that. What the signal was, why it was in those specific locations, what relationship it had to the arc activity in the areas, what, if anything, it was communicating, none of that was addressed by the analysis reports. The consensus stopped at, the signal is real and we do not know what it is. That is where the institutional documentation ended. Osei's theoretical material, effects document, went further, but carefully. He wrote, the signal is consistent with what you would observe if the environment itself were processing something. Not storing, not simply reflecting, processing, taking in information and doing something with it. Processing is a charged word in that context, and Osei knew it. He spent 2 paragraphs walking back from the more extreme implications of it. He was not claiming the sectors were alive. He was not claiming the signal was communication. He was proposing a model in which the heavy and extended arc bombardment of those areas had changed the physical substrate of the environment in ways that enabled information processing of some kind at a level below traditional biological complexity. He cited analogies in naturally occurring electrical phenomena. He was careful. He was as conservative as he could be while still reporting what he had observed. The document was filed, reviewed, classified at a moderate sensitivity level, and has not, as far as I can determine, been formally addressed since. I want to take what Osei found and put it alongside something from a different part of the archive. There are raiders who work certain sectors with high arc history who describe a consistent phenomenon. When they have been in those sectors for an extended period, they begin to feel that the sector knows their route. Not in the ominous sense of being stalked, more like navigational awareness. They describe finding that paths which were unclear on previous visits have become clearer. Not physically altered, just clearer in a way that feels like familiarity, like the sector is recognizing them. The most experienced raiders in heavily affected sectors describe a relationship with the terrain that is hard to characterize without language, that sounds too much like projection. One raider named Pharaoh, who had been working the same high arc sector for 3 years, described it in a way that I keep returning to. He said the sector had a memory. He said, not the same kind of memory I have, but a record. It knows what has happened there. When I go in, it knows I have been there before. It knows where I tend to go. It does not do anything with that knowledge as far as I can tell, but the knowing is there. You can feel it the way you can feel when someone in a room is aware of you, even when they are not looking at you. He paused in the interview and then said, I know that sounds like I'm imagining it. I stopped wondering whether I was imagining it about 2 years ago. There are things that you have experienced enough times that the question of whether you are imagining them is no longer the interesting question. The not interesting question had been replaced in Pharaoh's mind by a different one, which he articulated at the end of the same interview. He said, the interesting question is what it does with what it knows, whether there is anything that uses the record, whether whatever Osei's signal is processing gets used by something, and whether the raiders who have been in the sector long enough to have a substantial record, they are more or less safe for being recorded. He said he did not think the recording was hostile. He also said he was not convinced it was neutral. He said it is attentive in a way that feels purposeful, like something that is gathering information in order to do something with it eventually. He said, I try not to think too much about what eventually means. In the timescale I'm dealing with, the timescale question is one that appears in different forms across a lot of Arc Raiders lore. The Arc period has been going on for years by the time the game takes place. Human memory of it is limited to the span of human lives. The oldest people in the settlements have memories that stretch back to the first drops, or close to them. Their accounts of the early period, when the bombardment was new, and the surface was not yet what it became, have a different quality from the accounts of people who have only ever known the Ark world. The oldest survivors describe a transition, the surface changing. Not just physically, though physically too. Changing in the sense of becoming something different in kind from what it was. Becoming, in the specific language of one of the oldest survivor accounts I found in the archive, something that was not just damaged, but transformed. The oldest account I found is from a woman identified in the records only by her settlement designation, third elder, who was interviewed at a point when she was among the last surviving adults who had been adults when the first drops occurred. The interview was conducted as part of a settlement historical preservation effort. Third elder was asked to describe what the early Ark period was like, specifically in terms of how the surface changed. She talked for a long time. The interview runs to many pages in transcription. Most of it is the kind of account you would expect. Fear, chaos, the collapse of infrastructure, the reorganization of human society into the settlement model. But there is a section near the end where the interview shifts, and what she describes is not historical record, but perception. Third elder said that around the third year of the Ark period, she became aware of something she had not been aware of before. Not a specific event, an ambient quality. She said the air above the surface had changed, not chemically, qualitatively. She struggled to describe it and cycled through several framings before settling on one. She said it was like the surface had started to have a presence, like something had been summoned, or had arrived, or had grown out of what was already there, but in any case, there was now a there in a way that had not been true before. She said, "I know this does not make sense as a precise statement. I'm trying to tell you what it felt like. It felt like the surface had acquired an interior, like there was something behind it now, that there had not been behind it before." Third elder was one of the most lucid and coherent interview subjects in the settlement's historical record. Her other accounts are praised for their precision and reliability. The interviewers noted this. They also noted that this section of the interview, the perception section, was the one she had the most difficulty articulating. She was not a person who reached for imprecise language, and she was frustrated by the fact that what she was describing seemed to resist precise language. The interviewer asked her if she had discussed this feeling with other survivors from the early period. She said yes. She said, "We do not talk about it much, not because we doubt it, because it is not the kind of thing that talking about does much for. You either know it from being there at the right time, or you have to take our word for it." She said, "The surface is not empty. It has not been empty for a long time. The surface is not empty. I want to sit with that as a frame for the rest of what this chapter covers. Because the specific things Ark leaves behind, the material residue, the electromagnetic accumulations, the processing signals that Osei found, the temperature responses, and the navigational familiarity that Pharaoh described, all of these are individual data points in a larger picture that Third Elder is describing from the experiential side. The surface has acquired an interior. Something is there that was not there before. The individual observations are fingers all pointing in the same direction, and the direction they are pointing is toward the conclusion that what Ark has done to the surface is not only destruction was part of it, but what has grown in the space that the destruction opened is its own thing. Present, persistent, attentive, and operating on a timeline that has no particular relationship to human urgency. Let me talk now about what happens to Ark entity remains. When an Ark entity is destroyed, and some of them are destroyed, what is left behind is documented and studied. The physical material is catalogued, its properties assessed, its potential uses for settlement needs evaluated. This is all practical and documented. What is less documented is the behavioural aftermath. The way the sector around a destroyed entity changes. Not the material changes, which are well studied, the ambient changes. The quality of the area after the entity's physical presence has been removed. What radar teams and researchers who have been in these areas consistently describe is not a return to baseline. The sector is not emptied by the entity's destruction. There is a remainder. Something that had been in the entity's presence lingers. It is not the entity, but it is something that was with the entity and has not gone anywhere just because the entity was destroyed. One research team that spent extended time in a sector shortly after a significant arc entity had been disabled. They described the remainder using language that I initially found surprising, and then, in context with everything else, did not. They called it a weight. They said the sector felt heavy in a way it had not felt before the entity was there, and in a way that was distinct from the heaviness of sectors that had simply experienced bombardment without entity presence. Entity sectors feel heavy, they noted, in a way that has direction. The weight pulls toward where the entity was, or where its remains are, or towards something that is now in that space that was not in that space before it was there. The research team's lead, a scientist named Varuna, wrote a note that she apparently intended for herself rather than for the formal report, because it was found in her personal effects, rather than the official research file. She wrote, "I do not think we are studying residue, I think we are studying presence. I think these entities are not just physical bodies that can be destroyed and then studied in their absence. I think they are concentrated forms of something larger, and when we destroy a concentration of it, the thing does not go away, it disperses, back into the environment, back into the sector, maybe back into the surface as a whole. The entity is not the phenomenon. The entity is the phenomenon's local expression. And local expression and large-scale phenomenon are different things in ways that our current research methods are not designed to address." Varuna's note was found and filed alongside her formal report at the researcher's family's request, sometime after Varuna died, not on the surface. In the settlement, of unrelated causes, the note was added to the archive where it has been available, quietly, for anyone doing the kind of reading I have been doing. I do not know whether Varuna was right. I do not know whether the remainder is what she thought it was. But I think she asked the right question, which is, are we studying the entities, or are we studying something much larger that the entities are part of? The answer to that question changes the scope of what we think we are dealing with. And it changes the scope of what the surface is. Not a broken place, recovering slowly from bombardment by something that attacks and destroys. A place that has been, for years, in ongoing contact with something vast and complex, and that has been changed by that contact in ways that run deep enough that Third Elder could feel it in the air. The surface is not empty. The surface has not been empty for a long time. Chapter 5. Names in the dark. There is a practice among some raider communities that is not universal, but is widespread enough to appear in records from multiple independent settlements. Before a surface run, experienced raiders sometimes recite a list of names. The names are of raiders who did not come back. The settlement's missing. It is not a formal ritual. It has no official function. It is done in private or in small groups, quietly, before the access point opens and the run begins. Raiders who do it describe it as a kind of acknowledgement, saying the names so they know you remember them. Some raiders do it because it feels like respect. Some do it because it feels like warning. Some do it because they were taught to by someone who did not come back. And continuing the practice feels like the only form of continuity they have. I want to talk about one specific list, not a long one. A list that a raider named Sable kept in a small notebook that she carried on every surface run for the 4 years of her operational career. The list started with 2 names, people from her first settlement who had gone up and not returned before she began raiding. She added to it over her career as more people were lost. By the time she retired from surface operations, the list had 43 names. She kept it going even then, adding names of raiders from her community as they were lost. The notebook, the list, is in the archive because Sable donated it at the end of her life. She donated it with a note that said simply, "These names were carried on the surface. They were heard there. These names were heard there." That phrase implies something. It implies that the act of speaking the names on the surface was received, not just spoken into air, heard, by something. Sable never elaborated on this in any documented conversation. The note was the full extent of what she said about it, but the phrase is specific and chosen in a way that does not allow for dismissal as casual language. Sable knew the difference between saying a thing into air and saying a thing to something that could receive it. She chose the word heard. That is her testimony. The Names in the Dark practice is one entry point into a much larger question that runs through a significant amount of Ark Raiders lore. The question of what the surface does with the people it takes. The raiders who do not come back are not all, as far as the evidence suggests, simply dead. The Calloway case suggests otherwise. Isolde's transmission suggests otherwise. The single-set boot prints leading away from the White Line team's convergence point suggest otherwise. What the surface does with people is an open question, and the name recitation practice is, among its other meanings, a practice of holding that openness consciously. You say the names because you do not know that the person is simply gone. You say the names because the surface took them somewhere, and whether that somewhere is bad or good or simply other, you want the person to know they were not forgotten on the way. There is a researcher in the Lore Archive who has worked on this question more directly than most. Their documentation is fragmented and was clearly not intended as a unified research project, but it coheres around a consistent line of inquiry. The researcher, who identified themselves only by an initial in their notes, was working on the hypothesis that the surface maintains, in some form, a record of everyone who has been there. Not a passive record, an active one. The distinction being that a passive record is simply storage, an accumulation of traces, while an active record would involve the record doing something with what it stores. Being used, being referenced, being in some sense maintained for a purpose. The researcher gathered evidence from multiple sources, raider accounts of encountering what they believed were traces of specific previous raiders in sectors those raiders had worked, not just their equipment or their marks on surfaces, something less tangible. The quality of a space changing in a way that felt, to a raider who had known the person well, like their presence. One raider described entering a section of ruins where his deceased partner had worked extensively, months after she died, on a separate run, and finding that it felt like her. He could not define this more precisely. The quality of the light, the arrangement of the rubble, the way the sector felt under his feet and in his ears. He said it was as if she was still in there, not as a ghost in any traditional sense, as a persistent fact. The sector had known her, and the knowing had not gone away when she did. The researcher catalogued 17 such accounts over the course of their investigation. 17 independent reports from raiders who had entered sectors previously worked by specific people they had known after those people were gone, and had experienced something that they interpreted as the sector retaining something of those people. The researcher was careful about this data. They acknowledged that grief could explain a significant portion of it. The desire to find your lost person somewhere could produce a perception of finding them even in their absence. They acknowledged this, and then they noted the ones that were harder to explain with grief. 2 of the 17 accounts were from raiders who had never met the person the sector was associated with. They knew the name. They knew the person had worked that sector. They did not know them. And still the quality they described matched the quality that people who had loved the lost person described from the same spaces. The researchers' synthesis of this data was provisional, careful, and filed at the back of a large document that was primarily about something else entirely, which is perhaps why it has not been more widely discussed. They wrote, "The available evidence is consistent with a model in which the surface maintains a functional record of individual human presence over time. The record is not passive. It influences the perceptual experience of subsequent visitors to a location in ways that correspond to the quality of the recorded presence. In simple terms, the surface remembers people. It holds something of them that persists after they're gone. Whether this is a property of the surface material, a property of arc alteration, or a property of some third category of phenomenon is unknown. What the record is used for, if anything, is unknown. But the record appears to exist. The surface remembers people." I want to hold that sentence alongside the things this collection has already covered. The no-face figures in the quiet district. The room that was not a room, where the White Line team found something. The comeback wrong raiders who acquired a relationship with the surface that expanded their capacity to know things they should not know. Third Elder's description of the surface acquiring an interior. The settling sound that Raider Sirova heard and described as listening to something sleep. The surface is doing something with the people who come to it. It takes some of them. It changes others. It records all of them. And the record is not inert. Now let me tell you about something that happens with those records. There are Raider accounts, a smaller number, more difficult to find in the archive, of encounters on the surface with what the accounts describe as familiar strangers. Not familiar as in recognized from before. Familiar as in the quality of the encounter has a recognizable character to it, a texture that matches something the raider knows from their own life. One raider described encountering a figure in a collapsed structure that she initially thought was a colleague from her settlement. Wrong sector, wrong time of day, her colleague was not on a surface run. But the figure had the quality of her colleague, the way it moved, the angle it held its body, the particular way it was positioned in relation to the space around it. Not a visual copy, a functional impression. The raider approached the figure. It did not respond to her voice. As she got closer, she said, it became less specific, like a focus that blurred at close range. At arm's length, it had no individual quality at all. She said it was there, and then it was not clear, and then it was gone, and that the transition through not clear felt like the transition from a dream that is vivid when you are in it to the fragment that remains when you're trying to remember it after waking. The impression fades to its edges, and then is just gone. She was shaken not by fear but by recognition. She recognized the feeling of the encounter from something she had not experienced on the surface before. She recognized it from grief, from the way a person who has lost someone sometimes turns a corner and for a half-second sees them, not as hallucination, but as the shape of a past moment briefly intersecting with the present. She said, it was like the surface was showing me something it remembered. The surface was showing me something it remembered. That is the framework I want to use for the rest of this chapter, because I think it is the most generative way to understand what the records are for. If the surface maintains records of the people who have been there, and if the records can influence subsequent visitors' experiences, then the familiar strangers that raiders encounter might be the surface using those records, rendering them, making them briefly present in the space where they were stored. Not for the raider's benefit, necessarily, not with any intent that the raider can decode, but as part of whatever processing Osei found evidence for, the record being accessed, the presence being in some sense replayed. There is a raider whose account I want to close this chapter with. Her name was Rel. She had come back changed from an early surface run and had continued operating for several years afterward. She was one of the functional, changed ones. She operated well. She had the expanded sensory capacities. She had the new relationship with the terrain that the long-experienced raiders develop, but more pronounced. She went back to a specific sector, over and over, that she described as home, not her settlement, not anywhere she had been before the Ark period, a specific stretch of ruins in a heavily bombarded zone that she could not give a rational explanation for favouring. She just went there. It was where she felt most like herself. On one of her later runs into that sector, Rel filed an account that is in the archive under the heading Anomalous Perception Report. She described encountering, in a specific location within the sector, a gathering. That is the word she used, a gathering. Multiple presences, not quite visible, not quite audible, but present in the specific way that she had learned to perceive over years of being changed by the surface. She said there were many of them. She could not give a number. She said the feeling was of a space that was full, the way a room is full of people at a function. The specific social density of many individual presences coexisting in a bounded space. Rel stayed in the gathering for as long as her safety timer allowed. She said that while she was there, she felt, clearly, and without the usual uncertainty, that she was among people who had been there before her, people the sector knew, whose presence the sector had been maintaining. She said she did not recognize any individual among the gathered, but she said she recognized the type. She knew, because she was one of them, that these were the people the surface had kept. She said it with neither fear nor comfort, but with something she described as accuracy, as if she was simply noting a fact that had always been there, and she was finally in the right position to see it. She wrote in her account, "They are not lost. They are somewhere I have been walking toward for years without knowing it." Rel's account was her last filed report. She did not come back from the subsequent run. The settlement, which had seen this pattern before, did not conduct an extended search. They recorded her as a walker and closed the case with the dignity that her years of service merited. They added her name to the list, and somewhere, presumably, someone said it before a surface run. In the place where names are heard. Chapter 6. Deep Structures. There is a question underneath all the surface stories, a structural question that most of the individual accounts approach and then step back from, because the individual accounts are about specific encounters and specific effects, and the structural question is about something larger. The question is, what is the arc? Not in the sense of what are the entities and what do they want, which is the question that the settlement's tactical research focuses on. The deeper question, what is the arc as a phenomenon? Where did it come from? What is the relationship between the entities and the drops and the changes to the surface and all the things that the settlement's raiders and researchers have been documenting in these fragmented accounts? Is there a structure to it? Is there a centre? The settlements do not have an answer to this question. What they have is evidence that points in some directions without resolving into a clean picture. I want to go through that evidence, and I want to tell you some stories that come from the parts of the archive that deal with this question most directly, which are among the most restricted parts of the archive and among the most interesting. There is a category of arc entity behaviour that is called, in the research literature, coordinated convergence. The term means what it sounds like, multiple entities moving toward a common point. This behaviour has been observed, documented, and studied with the intensity that any significant behavioural pattern gets. The research consensus is that coordinated convergence is associated with major arc events. Specifically, it precedes them. Something about the entity behaviour patterns shifts in advance of a significant event, and part of that shift involves convergence. The entities are drawn to a common point before the event, and the event occurs at or near that point. What the research literature does not fully address is what the convergence point itself is. The entities move toward it. The event occurs there. The entities then disperse or are destroyed, or sometimes simply are no longer in the sector after the event. What is at the convergence point is described in the research as the event epicenter, which is a descriptive term rather than an explanatory one. It tells you where things are happening. It does not tell you why they are happening there, or what the point itself is. One researcher who worked on convergence behaviour for several years filed a note at the end of her formal analysis that said, "I think the convergence point is not just a place where an event happens. I think the convergence point is something the entities go to, something they are drawn to, in the way that living things are drawn to what they need. The question of what they need is the question I do not have an answer for. There is a raider, one of the more legendary figures in the lore, whose name appears in enough independent accounts from enough different settlements that their existence is as well established as a single individual can be in a world where records are fragmented and unreliable. They are referred to by the designation Long Walk. No one settlement claims them as their own. No one account describes meeting them directly. They are the source of information that filters into settlement knowledge bases without clear origin points, the way certain specific knowledge tends to circulate in communities that do not have reliable communication infrastructure. Someone knows something because Long Walk said it to someone who said it to someone who eventually said it to the person filing the report in the archive. What Long Walk is described as knowing is specific. They have been to places on the surface that most raiders have not been. Deep places. Not deep underground, though possibly that too. Deep in the sense of distance from any settlement. Deep in the sense of a time spent in sectors that most raiders do not survive for more than a run or two. Deep in the sense of whatever it is that the changed raiders accumulate over years of surface contact. Long Walk has more of it than anyone else in the records. When their observations filter back to the settlements through the relay of people who talk to people, they carry a quality of being reported from somewhere very far away, from a perspective that does not share all of the assumptions of settlement life. One of Long Walk's observations, filtered through 3 accounts that attribute it to them independently, is about the drops themselves. The standard model of drops, the model that the settlements teach as practical knowledge, is that they are ballistic events, objects descending from above, entities that come in through the atmosphere and hit the surface and do damage. The practical orientation is downward, from above to below, and the settlement's defense and survival strategies are built around this model. What Long Walk reportedly said is that the model has the direction wrong. Not completely wrong. The entities do come from above, but the drops are not initiated from above. They are initiated from below. Something on or in the surface calls them. The convergence in Long Walk's description runs both directions. The entities move toward the epicenter, but the epicenter calls them first. The surface calls the drops. That is the claim attributed to Long Walk, and it changes the basic orientation of everything the settlements think they know about the Ark. If the drops are called, then the surface is not a passive victim of bombardment. The surface is a participant. Something on the surface is in communication with whatever sends the entities, and that communication takes the form of a call. The thing that calls is presumably not human. It is presumably whatever has been living in the surface. Whatever Third Elder felt when she said the surface had acquired an interior, whatever is in the rooms that are not rooms and in the gathering that Rel found, and in the electromagnetic processing signal that OC recorded. The interior of the surface is the thing that calls, and what it calls comes now. I want to be precise about what this does and does not claim. It does not claim that the surface is hostile to humans. The surface changes people and keeps some of them and builds records of them. That is not the behavior of something trying to exterminate. It is much more ambiguous than that. The surface might call the drops, and also genuinely retain something of the humans who have been changed by surface contact. Both things could be true. An entity that calls predators to it is not therefore malign toward everything that enters it. Complexity in behavior is possible at scales we do not fully understand. Long Walk's claim, as reported, does not make the surface an enemy. It makes the surface a party, an agent with its own relationship to the Ark phenomenon that is not reducible to victim or villain. There is another piece of lore that connects to this. A settlement that had been studying Ark emergence patterns over a multi-year period identified something they initially could not explain. In a specific geographical area, the density and frequency of drops was significantly higher than the surrounding region, not correlated with any atmospheric or geographical feature that would explain it, not correlated with settlement proximity or resource distribution, just higher. The drops clustered there, the entities returned there. It was the most heavily bombarded area of any mapped region in the research team's dataset. A survey team was eventually sent to that area with full research mandate and substantial equipment. They spent 4 days at safe distance, observing and documenting. On the 3rd day, they identified the feature of the area that distinguished it from its surroundings. Deep in the heavily damaged zone, beneath layers of structural collapse and arc material accumulation, there was something. The survey team could not get close enough to study it directly. Their equipment registered it at a distance. It was large. It was old, their readings suggested, older than the arc period. It was active in ways that corresponded to OSE's processing signals, but at a scale and intensity that made OSE's readings look like a whisper compared to a shout. The survey team named the feature the deep signal. They filed their report and recommended immediate follow-up research and a significant resource allocation for investigation. The recommendation was reviewed. The resource allocation was not approved. The area's drop density was assessed as making any follow-up research too high risk to justify with current personnel and equipment. The deep signal file was flagged for future investigation when conditions permitted and filed. It is in the archive. It is a file with a name and some readings and a recommendation that was not acted on. It is also, if Longwalk's observation about the surface calling the drops is accurate, the most important thing in the archive. The thing that has been there since before the arc period, calling down the storm, calling the entities, calling the drops, and waiting in the accumulation of its own summoning with a patience that is entirely indifferent to human timescales. The deep signal was not the only feature of its type. The survey team, emboldened by their first finding and working from the hypothesis that the pattern might repeat, ran a broader analysis before their mission mandate expired. They found 2 more features of similar character in adjacent regions, not identical. Different readings, different scale, different signature, but recognizably the same category of thing. Not arc, older than arc, present in the surface with a depth of history that the arc period could not account for. The arc period had not created them. The arc period had perhaps activated them, or found them, or responded to them, if the direction of the relationship runs from them upward to whatever sends the entities, rather than from the entities downward. 3 features, 3 deep signals. The survey team's expanded analysis located them and filed the coordinates, and then the mission mandate expired and they came home. The coordinates are in the archive. The file is accessible. Nobody has gone to those coordinates with the specific intent of studying the deep signals since the original survey team. The settlement with the research mandate that produced the survey team had their research program restructured in the subsequent operational period, and the follow-up was never a priority again. The 3 deep signals sit in the surface, doing whatever they do, calling whatever they call at their patient and incomprehensible pace, undisturbed by any direct human investigation. I want to tell you something about what happens when settlements that know about the deep signals discuss them. There is a particular quality to those discussions that shows up in meeting transcripts and research review notes, and the occasional personal correspondence that ends up in the archive. The quality is one I want to characterize carefully. It is not fear exactly, not the fear of a direct threat. It is more the feeling of a fact that is too large to sit comfortably in the mind. When you encounter a thing whose scale and age and operation exceed your framework for what things like that can be, the response is not panic. It is a kind of cognitive vertigo, the sense that the ground you are standing on is still ground, but is much further from the center of things than you thought it was. That is how the deep signal discussions read. People working very hard to think clearly about something that does not fit inside the frames they have for thinking. One research coordinator, in a memo reviewing the survey team's findings, wrote something that I think captures the specific quality of that vertigo more precisely than anything else in the archive. She wrote, "What we have found suggests that the arc period, with all its devastation and disruption and cost, may be a recent event in a much longer process. The entities, the drops, the bombardment, the surface as we know it, these may be the most recent manifestation of something that has been operating for a long time before we were here, and will continue for a long time after whatever happens to us. We are not witnesses to the beginning of something. We may be witnesses to a very specific moment in the middle of something. The middle of something that does not particularly organize itself around us." This is not a comforting thought. It is, I believe, an accurate one. The middle of something that does not particularly organize itself around us. That is the structural thing, the deepest structural thing. All the individual stories, the raiders who came back, changed, and the rooms that should not exist, and the records the surface keeps, and the names that were heard, and the walker who said it felt like arriving, all of it sits inside a frame that is much larger than any of it individually. The deep signals are older than the arc period. They are older than the settlements. They are doing something that has a time scale measured in units that human history cannot span. And whatever that something is, the arc period is one of its expressions. The entities and the drops are called by it. The surface has been shaped by it. The changes in the raiders who spend enough time in contact with it, the expanded awareness, the residue, the way the surface holds their presence and shows it to subsequent visitors, these may be how the deep signals interact with human biology, not intentionally in any way that implies personhood or will. Functionally, as a side effect of whatever they do to the surface material around them, which includes whatever human tissue spends enough time in that surface material to be affected. You are not important to the deep signals. That is the clean version of the conclusion. Your life and your settlement and your survival are not factors in what they are doing, but you are also not unaffected. Contact with the process they drive changes the things that are exposed to it. It changed the surface. It is changing the raiders who work the surface long enough. It may be changing the settlements in ways that are slower and less visible, because the settlements are mostly underground. The process does not care about you, but the process touches everything, and to be touched by something this large, even incidentally, even as a side effect, is still to be changed. The surface is not empty. The surface has something in it that was there before the arc came, that called the arc in, that has been there for longer than the settlements have language to describe, and it is paying a kind of attention that does not need you to be important in order for it to see you. These are the stories that the surface of Arc Raiders holds in its record. All these lives and all these names and all these careful accounts of things that did not have names until someone tried to give them one. The raiders who went up and came back and wrote it down and went up again. The ones who came back different. The ones who did not come back at all, but sent one final transmission, 3 words across a dead channel, from somewhere the search teams could never find. The room that was not a room, with its smooth floor and its shadow cast from below. The blue hour light that comes from everywhere and takes teams from one side of a sector to another without their knowledge. The smell of a childhood kitchen, precise and impossible, on a surface that should not know what you remember. And somewhere under all of it, older than any of it, the deep signal. Doing what it has always done, calling what it calls, keeping what it keeps, watching, in whatever way a thing without eyes watches, the small warm creatures that keep returning to the ruins above it, saying names in the dark, continue no matter what. 1403. Strategized continuation of extended script with structured chapter, expansion, strategized continuation of extended script with structured chapter expansion. Chapter 7. The ones who listen. There are people in the settlements who never go to the surface. This is not unusual. Most settlement residents are not raiders. They are engineers, physicians, educators, logistics coordinators, food growers, system maintainers. The 100 categories of person that a functioning underground community requires to keep functioning. They have no direct contact with the surface. They live their lives below the drop line, and the arc period is, for them, a set of conditions that define the shape of their existence without being something they experience directly. The surface is a concept, a danger zone, the source of the things the raiders bring back. It is not a place they know. And yet, there are settlement residents who are not raiders and who nonetheless have a relationship with the surface that the official categories do not fully account for. Not because they go up, because the surface comes to them. This is documented quietly and incompletely in the settlement medical archives. It is documented as a sleep phenomenon, usually. As a category of recurring dream or perceptual disturbance that a non-trivial number of settlement residents report, most of them not connected to each other, and most of them filing their experience with the settlement physician because it is disruptive enough to their sleep that they want help with it rather than because they think it is significant. What they report in various forms and with various details resolves into a consistent core experience. They hear something. While sleeping or in the transition state between sleep and waking, they hear something that they describe consistently as coming from above. Not from above in the sense of the ceiling of their quarters, from above in the sense of direction, from the surface, muffled by all the rock and infrastructure between them and the sky, but audible in some way that bypasses the usual requirements of sound transmission. A sound from the surface reaching them below in a way that should not be physically possible. The sound is described in multiple ways. Some describe it as a voice, not articulate, not language, but with the quality of language, the rhythm and cadence of speech without any of its content. Some describe it as a tone, a single sustained note or a cluster of notes that are not quite a melody but have the feeling of music. Some describe it as the settling sound that Raider Sarova documented from her surface work, the sensation of something large and slow breathing or shifting its weight. The specific character of the sound varies. The direction it comes from does not. It always comes from above. It always comes from the surface. And it is, the people who report it say, consistently, not threatening, not comfortable either. It is simply there, a presence at the edge of consciousness that they are not sure how to relate to. The settlement physicians who collect these reports have a standard response, which is to assess the patient for stress indicators, sleep disorders, and the general psychological strain that underground life in an arc period settlement puts on people. They find in most cases that the standard indicators are within normal range. The people who hear the surface are not, in the main, people who are otherwise struggling. They are ordinary people who have developed, for reasons the physicians cannot identify, a sensitivity to something that the physicians do not have a framework for. The reports are documented as sleep-related perceptual anomalies and filed. The follow-up rate is low. Most patients report that the sound is not harmful and does not interfere with their function. They just wanted someone to know about it. There is a physician in a mid-sized settlement who became interested enough in these reports to compile them systematically. Her name was Dr. Corvin, and she was, by her own description in her research notes, not a person predisposed to unconventional conclusions. She was thorough and precise and had spent her career being useful to people in concrete ways. She began collecting the hearing the surface reports because she noticed that they were clustering, not randomly distributed among the settlement population. Clustering. The people who reported the experience were not connected to each other in obvious ways, but they shared certain characteristics. She started documenting what those characteristics were. The first characteristic she identified was proximity to raiders. Not being raiders themselves, but being in close relationship with active surface workers, partners, close colleagues, parents of raider-aged children, people who had someone they were emotionally connected to who regularly went to the surface. Corvin's initial hypothesis was that this explained the phenomenon entirely. Anxiety about a loved one on the surface, processed during sleep as a sound from above. That is a reasonable hypothesis, and she explored it seriously. But it did not hold. A significant fraction of the people who reported the sound had no close raider relationships. One of them had never met a raider in any personal capacity. She was a logistics coordinator whose work was entirely internal to the settlement. She reported the sound with the same characteristics as everyone else. The second characteristic was time. The reports clustered not just among certain types of people, but at certain times. The frequency of reports spiked following major arc events, not during them, when the settlement was in active response mode and nobody was sleeping normally, in the days and weeks after them. The post-event period when the surface was settling and the next pattern had not yet established itself. The surface was doing something in those periods that was reaching the people below, or the people below were, in those periods, becoming temporarily more open to whatever the surface was doing. Corvin was not sure which direction the causality ran, and she said so explicitly in her notes. The third characteristic was the most interesting and the most difficult to document. Corvin called it the trajectory. Some of the people who reported the sound were, over time, changing. Not dramatically, not in the way that raiders who come back wrong change. More quietly, over months or years of hearing the sound, something in their relationship to the world was shifting. They were not less functional. In some cases, they were more functional. They showed many of the lower-level characteristics of the come-back wrong raider presentations. The scale shift, the expanded sensory awareness, the apparently increased sensitivity to the state of the people around them. But they had never been to the surface. They had been reached by it some other way. Corvin's working hypothesis, which she stated carefully and with multiple qualifications, was that the surface was not only accessible from above, that whatever the deep signals were doing, whatever the surface's interior was, it was not physically contained by the surface. It reached down. Not far, perhaps, not into the deep settlement levels, but far enough to touch the people in its periphery. The hearing was one form of that touch. The gradual changes in the trajectory people were another form. The surface was not waiting passively for raiders to come to it. It was, in some functional sense, extending toward the settlements, slowly, quietly, through the rock and the infrastructure and the drop-proofed architecture of underground life, finding the people who were tuned to receive it and touching them. Corvin filed this hypothesis with every appropriate qualification, and the response from the settlement's research division was a polite acknowledgement and a classification. The document was given a standard sensitivity rating and filed alongside the other theoretical work that the division collected but did not actively pursue. Corvin continued collecting reports. By the time she retired, she had approximately 250 documented cases from her settlement alone. She estimated, based on what the reporting rates suggested about the population who did not report, that the actual number of people in her settlement who had the experience, at some frequency, was substantially higher. Perhaps several times higher. Perhaps a significant fraction of the settlement population. The people who heard the surface were not rare, they were just quiet about it. I want to tell you about one of Corvin's cases specifically. A man named Dial, settlement maintenance technician, mid-career, no particular connection to raider operations. He had been reporting the sound to Corvin's collection for about 3 years when he came to her with something additional. Not the sound, something he had seen. He had been in a maintenance tunnel, a deep one, accessing infrastructure in the lower levels of the settlement when he became aware of a light. Not a mechanical light, not a lamp or a readout, a quality of illumination in the tunnel that was not attributable to any source he could identify. He knew the tunnel. He had worked it for years. He knew where every light source was. This was not one of them. The light was brief, a few seconds. It had no specific shape or colour that he could describe precisely. He said it was like the memory of light rather than light itself, like the space where light had just been, rather than the space where light was. He was not frightened, he was curious. He described it to Corvin because he thought she would be interested, rather than because he wanted help. She was interested. She went back to the tunnel with him. No light, nothing anomalous by any standard measurement. But Dial pointed to the location, and Corvin ran a standard electromagnetic diagnostic on the area and found what she described in her notes as an elevated reading in the lower frequency range. Small, within the range of normal variation in an old installation, but there, and consistent, she noted, with the lower range signals that OC had found associated with heavy arc sectors on the surface. The deep signals, or something like them, had been here, in the lower levels of a settlement. Briefly, leaving a trace that faded into normal variation fast enough that Corvin could not have caught it without Dial's real-time observation. Brief and fading, but there. The surface had reached down to the maintenance tunnel level and left a mark that looked like a memory of light and sounded like something vast breathing if you were tuned to hear it. Corvin added the Deal observation to her collection and upgraded her estimate of how far down the surface's reach extended. She had been thinking in terms of the upper settlement levels, the parts closest to the surface access points. The maintenance tunnel was much deeper. If the reach extended there, then the spatial buffer that the settlements had built between themselves and the surface was not the protection it was assumed to be. Not from arc entity attack, against which the physical infrastructure was very effective. From the surface's interior quality. Whatever the surface's interior was, it moved through rock. It was not stopped by depth. It found whatever it found wherever those things were. I want to talk about the listeners as a community, because they are informally a community. People who hear the surface tend to find each other. Not always. Not in every settlement. But in settlements large enough to have some social complexity beyond pure survival management, and the listeners find each other the way that people with uncommon experiences find each other everywhere. They share what they know. They compare what they hear. They develop a language for it that is more precise than the language available in the medical reports. They are not organised. They do not have a formal practice, but they have a shared orientation, a way of relating to the settlement and to the surface above it that distinguishes them from people who cannot hear what they hear. What the listeners share, broadly, is a comfort with ambiguity that the settlement culture otherwise does not particularly reward. Settlement life in the Ark period is organised around survival, which means it is organised around clarity. What is the threat? What is the resource? What is the plan? Ambiguity is operationally costly. The listeners live in ambiguity. They hear something they cannot identify coming from a direction where the Ark lives, and instead of resolving it as threat or non-threat, they stay with it. They let it be unresolved. And from that practice of staying with the unresolved thing, some of them develop a relationship with the surface that, over years, begins to look a lot like the relationship that the comeback wrong raiders develop. Without going up, without any direct exposure, just from listening to something that was reaching for them and not turning away. The settlement that has the most documented listener community is not the one with the most raider activity. It is the one closest geographically to one of the deep signal sites, not close in any way that would be visible on a map. The signal site is kilometres away and underground, but close in whatever terms the signal uses for proximity. The population of that settlement reports the surface sounds at significantly higher rates than any comparable settlement. The comeback without going up trajectory people are more common there. The settlement has, informally, a reputation among other settlements in the network for being slightly different. The people there are described as calmer than you would expect, as attentive in a way that does not feel like surveillance, as comfortable in a way that does not feel like indifference. The settlement sits over a deep signal, and the signal has been touching its population for years, and the population has been touched and has become, gradually, something that carries a little more of the surface in it than other settlements do. Whether this is good or bad or simply different is a question the archive does not answer. Corvin's notes do not answer it. The people who hear the surface and were asked about it generally do not frame it as good or bad. They frame it as true, something that is true about where they are and what is above them and what the relationship between those two things actually is. Stripped of the practical framing that settlement life imposes, they are not frightened of what they hear. They are not comforted in any simple way. They are in a relationship with it, a non-negotiated, non-chosen relationship that exists because they are the kind of people who, when touched by something immense and incomprehensible, do not immediately try to classify it as threat or resource, but simply note that they have been touched, and by something real, and stay with that. I want to end this chapter with something that one listener wrote. She was not a raider, not a researcher, not a physician. She was a food systems coordinator in a small settlement. She wrote a short personal account and left it in the settlement's general archive under a personal filing designation that the archive staff eventually noticed and flagged as possibly relevant to ongoing law research. Her name was Petra. She wrote, "I have been hearing it for 4 years. It changes, not the quality of the sound, the quality of my relationship to it. In the first year I was afraid, not of the sound itself, but of what it might mean about me that I could hear it. In the second year I was curious. In the third year I was, I think, in something like correspondence with it, though I could not say what I was sending or receiving. In the fourth year I realised that the correspondence had been going on longer than I had been aware of it, that the relationship had been established before I knew it was being established, that something had decided I was worth listening to before I had decided anything about it at all." She paused in the writing and then added, "I find that I do not mind. I find that when the sound comes now, I orient toward it the way you orient towards someone you know well in a crowded room, not because you're looking for them, because you're already aware of where they are." Chapter 8. The Children of the Ark Period. There is a generation now that does not remember the before. The people who were children at the start of the Ark period are adults now, and the people born into the settlement world have known nothing else. This is significant in ways that the settlements are only beginning to understand, because the effects of growing up in a specific environment are different from the effects of being placed into that environment as a fully formed person. The older generation carries the weight of contrast. They remember the surface as it was, and they know what was lost. The younger generation does not carry that weight. They carry something different instead. The children born in the settlements, who have never known any sky but the one they access through radar reports and the settlement's archived imagery, are not defined by loss in the way that the first generation survivors are. They are defined by the world they actually inhabit, and the world they actually inhabit is the Ark world, the settlement below, and the dangerous surface above, and the sound that some of them hear from the direction of the surface before they know what they're hearing. The lore about this generation is sparse because the settlements are focused on immediate survival, and child development research is not a priority, but what exists is interesting. There are children in the settlements who demonstrate the comeback-changed characteristics without ever having gone to the surface. Not the deep exposure characteristics, the low-level ones, the scale shift, the expanded sensory awareness, the ease with the unresolved that the listener community develops over years of practice. These children have it from early, not acquired, present, as if what takes years of surface contact or years of listening to develop in an adult arrived, in these children, as a baseline, as if they were born into a state that their parents had to work or be changed to reach. The settlement physicians who have noticed this pattern are, predictably, cautious about how they describe it. The language in the medical records defaults to developmental variation, an atypical neurological profile, and other framings that keep the subject in familiar medical territory. But there are notes in the margins of the more speculative researchers, notes that ask whether this generation is different in kind rather than in degree, whether being born into the arc world, inside the reach of whatever the deep signals do to the surface and to the people on and near it, has produced something that was not possible before the arc period, something that is continuous with human but oriented differently, calibrated to the current world rather than the previous one. One of the most detailed records of a child with these characteristics comes from a settlement that was located in closer proximity to surface arc activity than most. Not because the settlement was unsafe, because the settlement's access infrastructure brought it into the edge of higher intensity zones that most settlements avoided. A girl named Lissa, born in the settlement, never gone to the surface, was flagged by the settlement's education staff at age 7 for an unusual set of behaviours. She was not difficult. She was cooperative, social, cognitively advanced by standard measures. What flagged her was a specific capacity that her teachers found hard to explain. Lissa knew when raiders were in trouble. Not all the time, not as a prediction, but in a way that was reliable enough that the settlement's communications team eventually started paying attention to her. She would, in the middle of an ordinary day, become still, not distressed, still, and then say something specific. One time she said that the team in the eastern sector needed to move north immediately. The communications team contacted the eastern sector team. The team reported they had been about to move through a passage that drone reconnaissance, checked after the fact, showed had been newly compromised by arc entity activity. If they had moved through it on schedule, they would have encountered the entity in a confined space with no exit. They moved north instead. They came home fine. This happened multiple times. The settlement documented it carefully after the third instance, because 3 coincidences constitute a pattern. Lissa was cooperative with the documentation. She was not frightened by her own capacity, and she was not boastful about it. She described it as knowing where things are, in the way that she knew where anything was, the way she knew where her mother was in the settlement, or where the food stores were, or where the surface access point was. A locational awareness that extended for her further and in more directions than it extended for other people. She said, "The surface is loud if you know how to listen." She said it at age 7, with the same matter-of-fact delivery she used for every other observation. She said, "I have always been able to hear it." Lissa was the most documented case, but she was not alone. The settlement's education staff, once they knew what to look for, found 3 other children in the school cohort with milder versions of the same characteristic, none as pronounced as Lissa. But the pattern was there: children who knew things, who were aware of the surface in ways that extended past any physical explanation, who had been born into the reach of whatever was in the ground and had been shaped by it from the start rather than encountering it later and being changed. The question these children raise is one the settlements do not have a framework for. The question is about what they are, not in a threatening sense, in an ontological sense. They are human. They grew up human, in human families, in a human community. They have all the characteristics of human beings. And they have something additional, something that the surface gave them, not by taking them up there and exposing them to it directly, but simply by being what it is and being close enough to reach them. They are, in whatever vocabulary you want to use, more than one thing. The human and the influenced by deep signals, coexisting in the same body, shaping together a kind of person that had not previously been possible. Whether this is the future of the settlements, is a question that nobody in the law is positioned to answer. The trend is documented, but under-discussed. The implications are enormous, and the settlements are too busy surviving to address enormous implications with the care they deserve. But the trend is there. Each generation born into the Ark world is, on average, slightly more of what Lissa was at birth, slightly more tuned to the surface, slightly more comfortable with the kind of awareness that takes adult raiders years of changed contact to develop. The deep signals are patient. Whatever they are doing it on a timescale that allows for generational shifts. The Ark world has been going on long enough for children to be born who did not know the before, and who are therefore the first human beings for whom the deep signal's influence is not a disruption, but a foundation. Third Elder, who described the surface acquiring an interior, lived long enough to know some of these children. She was asked in one of the later interviews conducted as part of the settlement's historical preservation effort whether she thought the children, who seemed different, were something to be concerned about. She took a long time to answer, and then she said, "I was there when the surface changed. I watched it happen over years. I watched people be changed by it, and resist being changed by it, and be destroyed by the resistance. The children are not being changed. They are being made. There is a difference." She paused. Then, change is a response to a force. Being made is just the shape of what you are. She paused again, longer. She said, "They are more adapted to this world than I am. I do not know if that is frightening or correct. Perhaps it is both. I want to close this chapter with something that happened not in a settlement but on the surface. A very brief account from a raider named Sova who was conducting a routine extraction run and encountered something that does not fit any other category in these stories. Sova was in a mid-risk sector that she had worked before, moving through a section of relatively intact ruins, when she heard a child's voice, clear, close. From inside a collapsed structure beside her route, Sova stopped. She was trained and she did not go immediately toward an anomalous sound in a compromised structure. She assessed. She listened. The voice said something she did not fully catch. She called out. No response. She moved closer to the structure's outer edge and listened again. The voice again, the same phrase or something like it, and this time she caught enough of it to report it later. What she reported hearing was a voice that said, in a clear and ordinary conversational register, "It is almost ready." That was the phrase. It is almost ready. Sova did not enter the structure. Her protocols forbade it, and her instincts agreed with her protocols in this case. She logged the sound at the location, noted the time and surface conditions, and continued her extraction run. On her return, she filed a full report. The settlement sent a survey team to the location. They found nothing in the structure, no child, no sign of recent human presence, no anomalous readings, nothing. The report was filed under anomalous auditory event, unresolved, and it sits in the archive the way that so many of these accounts sit in the archive. An observation, careful and specific, pointing at something that the available categories cannot hold. It is almost ready. I do not know what that means. I do not think anyone in the settlements knows what that means. But I believe Sova heard it. I believe it was real, and said from somewhere by something that has a sense of readiness, of an ongoing process approaching completion. What the process is and what ready looks like, from the inside of it, and what changes when it finishes, I cannot tell you. The archive does not go there, but the phrase is there, filed under unresolved, and the word almost does a lot of work in 4 syllables. Almost means it is not finished. Almost means it has a direction. Almost means there is more coming. The surface is not empty, and the deep signals are patient, and whatever they have been building towards since before the Ark period is almost ready, and nobody in the settlements knows what that means. And the raider who heard the child's voice in the empty ruin finished her extraction run, and came home and filed her report and went back up 3 days later, because the settlements needed what the surface had, and because the surface was there, and because someone had to go. Chapter 9. The Archive itself. I want to step back from the individual stories now and talk about the archive, not as a metaphor, as a real thing that exists in the Ark Raiders world. A distributed collection of records maintained by multiple settlements with varying degrees of coordination, storing the accounts and reports and research documents and personal testimonies that I have been drawing on throughout this collection. The archive is not centralized, it is not comprehensive, it is not well organized, it is the accumulated documentation of a civilization trying to understand something it cannot fully see, under conditions that do not allow for the luxury of thorough scholarly work. It is, like everything in the Ark world, the best that could be done with what was available. The archive has its own story, which is not usually told as a story, because the archive is the thing that holds stories rather than being a story itself. But there is a history to how it came to be, and how it is maintained, and what choices have been made about what goes in it, and what gets classified or restricted or quietly lost. And that history matters for understanding what the archive represents, and what it can and cannot tell us. In the early Ark period, documentation was not a priority. Survival was the priority, and documentation is something you do when you have enough stability to think about the future. The earliest records in the archive are practical. Supply inventories, route maps, entity encounter logs that are basically just entries saying entity present, sector abandoned, losses noted. The arc of the documentation mirrors the arc of settlement development. As the settlements became more stable and the survival margin improved, the documentation became richer. More detail, more reflection,